Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that this is Crow's Nest Q7. What's up, dude?
Hi.
You always have the most tame responses to my most insane interest.
Yeah, I went back and listened to a lot to process. Really. Yeah. Wasn't sure.
I went back to listen to the 5th episode earlier, and I intro it with like one of those memes where it's like, "This is my name. Don't call me. This is my other name. My last name," or whatever. Like that's the format. And I did that, and you're just like, "Hi." The reaction. Yeah. So that's it. That's a good dynamic. We'll have to keep that going. How you doing, dude? What's going on?
Yeah, as we've had March Madness, we've had Antikythera work, we had a lot of things. Yeah. I've played some games, you've played some games.
I've actually, there's even been changes to the Discord server since the last episode, so I guess I can even start with that as our basic, easy icebreaker. So I added a channel called Good Games Exist. It's a very bold claim, but for people of the community who want to share the games they are working on, they have the opportunity to do so by posting a link with a short description of what their game is, and then I just pin it. And then there's some discussion about, you know, whatever. Like recently, Mesk was talking about his game, and he was going back and forth with Mr. Z, another community member who's responsible for the game Renown. And so, yeah, they were talking about like Unreal and all that silly stuff. And before then, there was some conversation about Rerun, which you played recently. We'll get to that later on. So, yeah, it was nice to have a little island for people to discuss their own games. Sort of like, I guess before people were mostly using the gamer channel for that, or maybe at worst Stellar Icon, which is our general chat. It's not very useful.
Another thing that you changed is you renamed Fraud Nights to CMBW matches, and you actually moved it to CMBW category, which makes it 10 times easier to actually access. So that's nice.
Yeah, so Fraud Nights used to be the channel name back when, I mean, the reason why it existed and why it was in the middle of Pizza Factories, which is our general hangout section. See, there used to be like a bunch of meme categories, and then now we're only down to Pizza Factories as the only, well, I guess there's manly materials, so there is that, but whatever, you guys get the idea. And if you don't, then don't worry about it, just ignore it. It's sort of like the, you know, we talked earlier about how we want to be really ambitious with the storytelling of our first game in Antikythera. And since we're not being super ambitious with like the gameplay, besides the fact that it's still going to be better than everything else that came out after, it's not ambitious for us. That's like default for us. But, you know, ambitious for us in gameplay would be something like Onitar with its crazy progression system, or like Xibalba.
Yeah, we're basically trying to reach the parity with what we had in CMBW and also try to do a bit more, but...
Yeah, and also, I mean, also something that's a bit different too, right? It's like got its own identity towards it, right? So there's definitely some changes there from what you might be like familiar with or whatever. But yeah, so we're trying to be ambitious with the storytelling. And one of the things that I like to say is if you're not interested in the storytelling at all, you can still enjoy the greatest gameplay that's there. Like that's going to be part of our Indie Fun pitches, mentioning that there's like, you know, these aspects of it that are more than meets the eye, but you can also just disregard that and enjoy the gameplay. So I kind of feel like that about our Discord server too. You can really understand what Pizza Factories actually means and manly materials and all that stuff. Or you can just ignore that and just be like, all right, I know this is the general chat, so that's good enough for me. So you know where you post the memes. That's really all you need most of the time. Now, there's a bit more going on here because the Fraud Nights thing used to be where we congregated for playing any game. It didn't have to be Cosmonic Brood War, or, you know, for a while it was my mod of Counter-Strike where it was called Fraud Strike, of course. And then beyond that, there was also like, you know, maybe we would get together to play Risk of Rain 2. I think that happened once. Star Wars Battlefront was once like the old game.
Oh, yeah.
We tried that once.
We used to have like really weird Fraud Nights where we played like just random, the most bizarre games I remember.
Yeah, we also used to play random Brood War mods that were not Hydra and or CMBW, so... Yeah, those were the dark days, and now we're into the information age. But yeah, so definitely something that I think is, you know, it was high time. Nobody's really played anything using that channel. Like there was the last time somebody played something that wasn't related to CMBW was when there's a group of the people here played Age of Empires 2, I think, but they used the RTS channel for that, so it wasn't even useful. Even used for that. So I figured, yeah, let's just rename it and move it away, and that'll be that. The third change, because 3 is that I did add the voice channel to the Coffee Crew area. if you're a donator, a supporter, whatever, on Coffee, ko-fi.com, then you can get access to that. And that's basically where sometimes we'll hang out while we talk design or whatever. I was actually thinking, we're not doing it for this episode, but in the future, Veeq, we might decide to go into that channel when recording Crow's Nest and record it live. Like, it'll still just be recorded and everybody else will be silent. But if they want to follow along with the conversation, there will be like a point where if somebody happens to be listening during that time, they could like ask their question live or get a follow-up or whatever.
Yeah,
and maybe that could be kind of interesting.
It could be cool.
Yeah, so I know that's just an idea. Maybe we'll think about the format and stuff. We did get a response from Myrion about that, who said that it's based on the assumption that the dev streams we would work like less frequently or less less focused in a less focused manner if we were doing streams, and how like streams sometimes can slow us down. He was saying like, yeah, maybe don't do that. But we've independently come to the same conclusion, Veeq, that we actually do less work if we're not streaming. And I've talked about this with Mesk actually too. It's like sometimes, yeah, you can be in the mood to just work without the stream and you can get a lot of work done. But if you're kind of like feeling a little bit of resistance to it, doing the stream part is kind of good because it forces you to just be like, well, I got to do something because there's people potentially watching. So yeah, that ends up being pretty useful.
Probably talk through your stuff more and
yeah. I gave the example that actually even playing an RTS like CMBW, I play better a lot of the times when I'm narrating my build because I'm trying to explain it to whoever happens to be watching the stream. So that even that alone is like kind of an instant, like it gives you a little bit of evidence to the idea that maybe that increases your like focus or awareness or whatever, because it actually lets you sort of talk through the problems that might be happening or whatever. So yeah, pretty neat. So there is all of that. But yeah, so those have been the updates. But that's not all that's been updated. What's been updated in Antikythera, Veeq? Do you know? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of work towards improving the pathfinding, and now it's like previously it was like very joggy, where like you would be able to see that there is a tile grid or whatever, and now that's like almost gone. Like I used to smooth paths, so it wasn't as bad as I make it sound to be, but now like the path smoothing is sort of the part of the extra algorithm, making it way more intelligent into actually making the smooth paths. And there's also been a lot of work done to make units not have issues around collisions. So previously we had issues where like workers would maybe spin when they try to return resources or something. There's one more bug where like unit to unit sometimes fails because like the current square is considered collision or something. Not exactly sure yet, but basically it fails to make a path then. But basically it's like if you just take a single unit and you try to path it towards like terrain and maybe towards some static units, it's just gonna path pretty well, and it's like respecting the size. It can will know where to fit, where it can fit and where it cannot, and
yeah.
It's way better in that sense. It's just like have to improve some dynamic stuff to unit to unit and a few other link bugs. But yeah.
Yeah, when we talked about this privately, you had mentioned that right now it's not very optimized or performant or whatever. But I wanted to bring that up, but also as part of the same topic. We've also spoken on this show and in private, of course, about the importance of getting something so that you can then iterate on it and turn it into something better, right? And at this point, now that we have pretty good functionality when it comes to just pathing units around or single units, like you were saying, we now know what the pain points are to iterate on and improve it because we have something that like works at its core. And as far as I understand, this is obviously very much down to downstream of the Theta Star stuff you were researching. You talked a little bit about that at the end of the last episode. So
it inspired me I don't know if that was Fetaster or some other paper I read, but it inspired me to do like some position offset trickery to make the tile node. Because I conceptualize tile nodes as actual like, oh, it's the center of the unit and I have to respect that and whatever. And now I just embed additional data about it, like, oh, here the unit would actually stand, not on the center. It would be like some other offset, depending on the size. That's basically what I did, and that's what I got inspired to. And Feta Star is actually just a very simple concept. It actually I actually removed lines of code thanks to it because
that's always nice.
it was
We
just
add
simpler.
functionality, improve functionality, but remove code. Pretty good.
I mean, it technically is a bit slower than path smoothing, I think, because it's like, especially with like when A-Star has to scan a lot of stuff, it's basically on the runtime of A-Star, it would like actively smooth the paths and like compare if it was a shorter path than the like previous optimal one or whatever. So that's basically the gist of it. It's actually really simple in concept in implementing it, since I already had like they call it line of sight, which is basically like, oh, the unit can walk a line through this from this tile to this tile without any collision. So that's what they call line of sight in the paper, but I just have some other name.
There you go.
That would be it. In terms of like the performance, I'm not sure, because like a lot of about this approach is what makes it slow. So I'm not sure if it's as positive as you're making it to mid being, but like it's definitely better to have it than not have it, because at least I now know a few more things, right? Like,
well, I'm not necessarily suggesting we can keep exactly this system and just magically improve it for sure. In fact, I suspected that something about how this works was actually dictating the speed. But the main thing I would say is that we at least know of a working solution that we can, use for now and then iterate on it in the future. And
there's just more knowledge that we have. It's just like with programming, it's like each requirement you have is just another constraint that prevents you from like optimizing stuff sometimes. Because there's like some ways that you can like, oh, maybe you could rearrange the code and it will be faster that way, or like maybe you get less cache misses, or maybe you like pre-compute some stuff or whatever. But the more constraints to the code you have, so the more requirements, the harder it is to actually pull things out. So that's something I will just have to wrangle with at some point. But it's just a little bit worrying that it's not as performant as I would want it to be. But still, better done than not.
Yeah, I agree. I also think that, funnily enough, this game actually won't have the same. I mean, it will still be possible to achieve the maximum scale of CMBW in this game, but I don't know that it'll be as common, or if it is as common, it'll take longer in the game time because the game's pacing is a bit slower, right? So at least that's the plan right now. Like it could evolve into something else later on, but that's part of the reason why we have like larger unit sprites and stuff. Like our plan for the basic worker of one of the factions was for it to be the same size as something like a siege tank in Brood War. And the reason I use that example is just like, obviously by default, the siege tank is maybe like 2.5 or 2.25 times the size of the worker, the SCV in this case, I guess. And in this particular case, so that doesn't mean that we're just uniformly scaling everything up. It just means that like that will be probably our baseline. Like if you kind of think about workers as the baseline size, then you would kind of think about like, okay, everything, like some units might be smaller than a worker, like you think about a Zergling and Brood War or whatever, but a lot of the cases you'll see units that are bigger, like workers are usually on the smaller side.
I feel like we sort of have to be bigger just because we have bigger sprites, right?
Well, we don't have to be, but because that's a separate argument. That's because like I really value the individuality of how units behave, like how important individual units are. So the individual significance of a unit in an RTS to me is really valuable. And it's something that we lose if we go the, Supreme Commander, Total Annihilation type route, where a lot of the times you'll just zoom out and things will become shapes on a grid or whatever, instead of, you feel like you're really interacting with a game.
I also just...
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that the general sense I get with the game's resolution, since Antikythera obviously runs a native 1080p, is if we were to have the exact same sizes for everything, it wouldn't totally sacrifice unit individuality, but you would just feel less intimate about the units you were controlling because you would be by default zoomed out more. They would occupy less space relative to the default. Because for people who don't know, we're in CMBW, we're working with a 4x3 it's like 640 by 480 resolution, but it's 2x upscaled for most of us because we're usually playing in windowed mode with a 2x upscale. And then if we're playing in full screen, then obviously it's just not stretched to fit your screen like widescreen aspect ratio. There's still black bars, but it's stretched in the sense that it's just upscaled to whatever that is, right? So
actually in Antikythera, we were basically getting the same unit sizes that we would get in windowed CMBW without the 2x.
Yes, exactly. But so like we had 640 by 480 size graphics or whatever for the individual units, like that attuned to that scale. But they were taking up like much smaller screen space because we have 1080, like 1920 by 1080 for the game, right? So
I still feel like we should not be like the same zoom as Brood War because it's really like I feel like it's really claustrophobic and it disallows any scale actually. But
yeah, so my solution to that was to like I gave you the ideal like requirement. I mean, we're not going to be in the same zoom. My ideal situation was if you take the current Antikythera we have and you zoom in once, I think it was like just one scroll forward, which I actually don't know how much of a size difference that is. That's sort of like the ideal scale of the units, but that's still different than what Brood War has or whatever. Like it's not really the same thing as the 2x upscale, right?
Yeah.
It's still less than that. It's just that like that was a solid middle ground. So
we've been also like considering the tile size of 48 pixels instead of 32 pixels.
Yeah.
That's something we have not tested yet, but
yeah, we haven't rendered the graphics out in that like the tile environment.
Well, I could technically stretch them or whatever just to test the sizes, but yeah, we would want a higher res graphics for that anyways.
Yeah. Well, the graphics have been some of the nicest stuff. Like obviously one of the other things that has been updated recently is I've been working with some level design for the demo. And just playing around with like our own environment graphics. We did cheekily demo them in episode 5's thumbnail, so you can check that out if you want more info on that, I guess. Very, very small amount of showcase, but yeah, there's like houses, like house graphics and whatnot. And so I don't think at the time we even had a center tile, so I think they almost looked like gardens or something because they had dirt in the top. I don't remember actually. I can't remember what they looked like. But basically like, it's just like some ramshackle, broken up townhouses. And we have some other tiles, like we obviously have the dirt cliff, the rocky cliff or whatever. So we have a couple of things like that. And Balathal's been putting those together. And there doesn't really exist a crazy amount of like, as far as I know, he's had to like figure out by himself how he can render everything out for using Blender. And it can sometimes be quite taxing. Because of however he has to put the things together. Like there are some really silly manual corrections he had to make to the rock cliff, for example, because of how you generate rocks in Blender or how he chose to do it, but also how like his requirements for like making sure that they tiled and making sure that like it was the right size and stuff. And if we tell him, hey, can you render this out in 48 pixels instead of 32? I have a sneaking suspicion he'll have to manually recorrect a bunch of stuff again too. So that'll be great if we end up finding out that he's lost all of his hair because he's ripped it out while trying to get Blender to work. We understand what happened.
But speaking about scale, I wanted to ask you about the thing that you were talking with the game we're making. Is there actually? You think we should share this? You think we should share the amount of tiers? Because I actually don't remember.
Yeah. So we were thinking we'd probably cap out at 3 tiers, just like CMBW currently does. And I mean, technically, Protoss in CMBW has tier 4, right? But that's just like conceptually because on the website or whatever, like you can't really figure that out because they operate differently. So the reason why
I feel like the only real difference was it was on a different command card, but that's not even true anymore. So.
No, yeah, in game it used to be on a different command card. That's right. But on the website it's still listed as tier 4. That's just because of their costs being like, it's a little bit higher. I mean, I could condense the tree a little bit by moving things back down, but on the website or whatever. But it wouldn't really matter too much.
I made that question so dramatic. Just the tiers.
Yeah, I was waiting.
Maybe for someone get hyped.
Yeah, dude. Of course. Should we reveal the number of tiers? Of course the answer is 3. Like, come on, dude.
So it's 3.
It's 3. So the reason why it's 3, the reason why we're not going higher is, again, something that you actually mentioned is that we want to achieve some form of parity between what we have in our first game and what we have right now in CMBW. We're not really doing just, hey, let's port CMBW. Because, I mean, for one, we want to sell this game. Like, we want it to actually be a game that we can, make money off of enough to continue development and actually be able to produce more games in the future. Like, sort of like how I talked about, let's get a working version of pathfinding, and you did, you researched Theta Star and you did all these other changes and stuff. It's like, yeah, we just need that so we can figure out what's next for pathfinding in the future. But like, we have a working version now. That's kind of how I view this first game, is like, this game is, hey, we need a game so we can make other games in the future. And I mean, that doesn't mean that we're not putting love and effort into it, obviously, but it's like, as much as this game is exciting, it's also like one of the reasons why it's exciting to us is that it represents an opportunity to do even better things in the future, which is exactly what CMBW represents in many ways. Like, we'll get to it eventually, but we obviously made a lot of changes to CMBW recently. And the main reason for it is not, I mean, hopefully, like, one of the reasons is, or one of the side effects of the changes are that it improves the gameplay. But another one is experimentation, so that we can figure out if we've discovered a more valuable information and a potential solution to like the pacing problem. And by problem, I just mean, like, broadly speaking, you have to create some sort of game pace that is desirable. Here's what these changes result in. So now you have more experience to draw upon. Exactly like the pathfinding thing, actually, because now we know another kind of pathfinding. We know Theta Star. We know like what the results of that are. And so we can draw upon that when we're making observations and decisions about what to do next, right?
I suspect that might actually be useful if I decide to like do some conceptual grouping of the tiles or whatever. Mm-hmm. So instead of like having tiles, I would actually have like groups of terrains. Sort of maybe how movement area or like
the Pathfinder regions or whatever. Or what
whatever. Sort of like that. So it might be useful. And speaking of pacing, we'll actually be talking about pacing later, and it's CMBW pacing. So.
Right. Yeah. So, cool. I mean, that's why I was saying earlier is we'll eventually talk about some of the changes we made, but like a lot of the times it's just figuring stuff like that out. And like, that's why we're going to cap at 3 tiers, because we want the game to be, more, maybe like it's already going to be more units than most games have. I feel like, most RTS games don't have as many units as our explicitly not ambitious RTS game that we're making.
We won't have a supply cab or anything that anyway, so. Like, if you...
Oh, I'm not even talking about number of units that you can train in the map. I mean, like, unique units in a Techtree. Like, we're already still going to outpace most RTS games, right? So, like, I think the current plan is...
So like, where one race will have, like, triple the unit that Age of Empires 4 has in total, so...
Well, didn't you define Age of Empires 4 as having, like, 4 units or something? I can't remember. You did something that destroyed me. Because you were like, do you know how many units this game has? And I was like... 20, 40, what? Like, there's so many regions, and all Veeq over here says is they have like 3 or something. But I guess you meant like archetypes or something. Like they have capital.
No. I was actually saying like 20. I think you were like guessing actual, like you were giving them the optimistic guess where you were saying like, oh, they have 100, 200, 300. No, the other way.
Yeah. 3.
It's 50.
Yeah.
Not 30.
I mean, as an example number, which I can release here, I'll just go to my.
I think it was actually 17, but
not classified number. So in the first race, we have the first race planned through tier 2, although we are missing 1 branch, and we already have 20 military units planned, just for tiers 1 and 2. So it's like 10 units per tier. Tier 2 is going to receive at least 3, maybe 5 more. And then there's obviously going to be tier 3 with the same number of units as tier 2. So that means that, all that math put together means we're looking at an upper bound per race of, I guess that would be, what is this? 40 units, I guess. It would be 40 units per race is what it looks like right now. So that's more the unit. 40 units is more than Brood War has total.
So now something that the Frogs would want to know: how many static defenses?
Ah, there we go. Yeah, because everybody really likes their static defense. I think there will be 2 per tier, but I'm not sure about that one yet. That's probably going to.
You think it would be like anti-ground on tier? Probably not, right?
The first race has those separated. We do not plan a bunker right now, a bunker equivalent, for any race, but that
No
might
feet?
change. No feet. Yeah, there's definitely no liftoff. See, this is one thing that like I actually don't know how I feel about, because on the one level, like on the one hand, if I think about all those StarCraft clones I played last year, some of the things that was kind of interesting is like, there's a race in, I think it was, I can't remember what game it was now. It's
Dude,
probably
I
Aatrox.
just have to say, like,
Yeah.
if you don't want to be like Brood War, you just can't have one race have liftoff or like mobile buildings. You could make all the races
No,
have mobile buildings.
that's silly. I think what would happen is like basically if you wanted to have liftoff and you wanted it to not be like Brood War, you would have to have like, if there was an add-on type mechanic, you would have to have that be on a different race than whoever has liftoff, so that they're separate ideas. And whoever has liftoff can't have repair.
right.
Repair has to be on a different race. So and then the guy who repairs can't build structures externally. They have to sacrifice their workers.
Oh, just make the repair unit be a military unit instead of a worker.
Yeah, there you go. Like a cleric, but if they could heal buildings in CMBW.
And for cost, I guess.
Yeah. The energy cost, obviously. Wink. Supply cost, obviously. Wink. No. Can you imagine?
I'm actually surprised that not many things like repair. I think is the only ability that actually like drains resources at all, right?
Yeah, we have a salvage ability we implemented in CMBW, but that's the inverse. So, but I don't think
imagine it takes you 1 minerals to like activate your passive or something.
Well, technically, it does take minerals to stock scarabs and interceptors in Brood War, right?
Oh, right.
I don't know if
that's
you
no longer true in CMBW, right?
No, I mean the Acantor doesn't even have a scarab anymore, and the stewards are built automatically. So we removed the mineral cost specifically for, like, I was always going to remove the mineral cost if I was going to make it automatic, but I also didn't really see I didn't see the sense in like, because the unit is harder to get. The Solarian is harder to get than the carrier, or like maybe not harder. It's technically easier, but it's like more expensive, right? So I was like, well, if I really want to sell this, first of all, we're going to give them 12 stewards, by the way, and second of all, we're going to give them the automatic replenishment.
I feel like it has to be like sort of equivalent in the time cost, but actually way more. You get way more opportunity cost because you can't also build like a gateway and a cybernetics core and whatever.
If you were rushing them out, yeah, that's probably true. That's why you wait, right? So
yeah.
But yeah. Anyhow, that's all to be said.
The last thing I have to mention about Antikythera, just so I don't forget, is that we added battle reactions. Sort of like Brood War, where weaponless units will flee, and units with weapons will just acquire the target, and will also, regardless of if they flee or not, they will also ask nearby units to help out.
Yeah. Now, first of all, I have one question for you, which is, and I forgot to ask this. This is actually a genuine technical question. If the unit is attacked by an air unit, but it only has a ground attacking weapon, will it also flee? I mean, if it acquires the target,
I don't remember if I called the right stuff. As if I just called I probably called like a function is like, can this unit attack this unit?
I see.
So if it can, then maybe I just checked weapon count, which would be the naive approach.
Well, it's something that's easy to fix.
That's something that I can fix later.
If it is a problem, yeah.
But it's supposed to flee, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
That's
now you had this is actually an interesting point of conversation anyway, because you actually felt like battle reactions were bad. Can you explain your position? Do you have a difference of opinion now?
I felt just like I wanted to have full control over my units and them not automatically cucking me. Since if you're like siege or whatever, your units, like, unless you hold pose, you just have to constantly micro them back. But if you hold pose, then you have to remember to do a different thing. So you either get cacked by automatic battle reactions, or you get cacked by them not being consistent with hold pose. Was my like reflex on that. And I was specifically interested in what your thoughts are. I know you despite automation, so I actually expected you to be even more hardcore about than I thought about it. So But
No, because I've played
like
Red Alert 3, and Red Alert 3 has aggressive mode, which was just a chore you had to do in order for your units to actually respond to threats. So
can you sort of explain how that worked?
Yeah, if you didn't set them to aggressive mode, then they wouldn't respond to being attacked. So it was the inverse. No, there was something else too, like if you attacked move, if you attack moves without aggressive mode on, something stupid would happen where they wouldn't actually like get targets acquired correctly, I think. That might have also just been the game being weird though, so I can't really. I know for sure, like for a fact, they would much less frequently respond to being attacked. Maybe never respond to being attacked if they weren't on aggressive mode, and they didn't default to aggressive mode, so you had to set it for every unit you trained. So, like this was mostly notable when you would play a campaign mission. They'd have some cutscene, and then out of the cutscene, units would be attacking your units, and your units would not be responding. And I had to like manually set them to aggressive mode. So it was just a trick.
I know that, like in Age of Mythology, you have something similar where you have stances and you set the default stance. And you can, that's like a setting you do in settings. And it's like passive, defensive, and aggressive, I think. So.
Yeah, I know some games have that. Warlord's Battlecry lets you set stances based on the factory that's producing the units. So you can set them to rampant, and they will randomly walk around the map like they're junkyard dogged in Brood War. A bunch of other silly things, which is always entertaining. I'm sure that actually can be used at high level. If such a thing as high level Warlords Battlecry play exists, I'm sure that was used somewhere, but I just have memories of like, it was my father's favorite game, and he would just like spam like eagles from the eagle producing unit structure, like the Eyrie or whatever the nest was. And he would spam those on scout so that he could find the last structure that the enemy had automatically. Cause he's like hiding from him or whatever. He's like, this is stupid. I'm just going to do that. I'm like, even as a kid, I didn't
fight stupid with stupid.
Yeah, that is a good one. I mean, that's how people deal with ion cannons, right? They just build ion cannons. So makes a lot of sense. I'm actually kind of surprised we haven't been able to
switch to turns.
You did.
Even I can have an excuse. Well, I'm still technically a random main. It's just
you switched to Terran to practice because I've been you've been practicing Terran against any of the AI games that we've played or whatever. I know that much. So.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess in general, battle reactions to me seem like they are the sensible default because you would expect your unit to you would expect your unit to retaliate if it's attacked. It's just there are some cases where you want to hold position, which is going to be construed as, I have to babysit it. But it's like, whenever you're designing for something and there's like a default most common use case, you want to cater to that. I
just wasn't sure what the default use case was, right? So.
Yeah, well, having played Red Alert 3, I can safely assure you that aggressive mode is not the fucking default. It should not be the default. It should not be.
I mean, it should be a default. The passive mode shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is you shouldn't have to set it to aggressive mode. Yeah, the passive mode should not be the default. There doesn't really make much sense to change from. Like I've said this before.
It's basically swapping stop with hold pause, right?
Yeah.
And stop would have to be named like alert or something. I don't know. That would be dumb.
I can't remember what I mean, we planned on having a hold fire mode at some point, or a hold fire button at some point. I don't know if we're still going to do that, at least in this game. But I remember thinking that like some people were complaining that they weren't able to do that for the ion cannon. But to me, I just think of like, why would you ever want that? You know what I mean? Like, I just don't quite understand.
Well, like in Brood War, you can like trick with a bug. Trick lurkers to not attack because you just
spam or something. You spam stop. You have to manually keep spamming
it's not manual. I saw a guy do like F2S series and he made them not attack for like a minute and he was microing his hydras, so
that's banned in tournaments though. So I mean maybe it's not banned anymore. But that was banned for the longest time. I don't know.
Yeah, that was just a ladder, so nobody cares, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean you could do all sorts of shit on ladder and nobody cares, like the gas trick.
You can hack minerals now, right? Like you can just.
Oh, you can. Yeah, people will mineral hack. I just mean within play, there's like something you do to gases that like makes your worker fly or something. It's really stupid. The game is not.
I saw that in pro play too. Like.
Yeah.
So Day9 was recording his like guides and he was like showing off like Flash trying to. It was like TVZ and he was trying to like bug his vulture across like a unit blocker with eggs.
Yeah, you can lay a mine to make it move forward. Yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about there's something that actually lets you make flying SCVs.
Oh, just forever.
Yeah. People were using them to like worker rush people because you'd have like 10 of them stacked up and you wouldn't be able to tell. So it's just insane. Anyway, Brood War is not very well programmed, as we all know, because we've been reverse engineering.
CMBW is a bit better, but
yeah, well, it has more. Well, maybe it doesn't have more bugs. It definitely has bugs that we want to fix, but it's just there's diminishing returns on anything you do there. We would definitely.
we already fixed like 1,000 bugs, I'm pretty sure. So
Yeah.
just maybe some of the bugs we caused, but that doesn't matter.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yes, yeah. A lot of the bugs we find are like us creating more instances where the default code can bug out. And so we just have to hook more stuff to turn those off or whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, it's just like Brood War code will sometimes have the weirdest assumptions, and then if you don't meet those assumptions, they would just break horribly.
Exactly. And speaking of assumptions, dude, do you have any idea how many assumptions you're going to have if you think like from the code base like perspective, there's so many assumptions of a unit limit that is 1700, but that assumption is no longer true because we've actually got the extenders
March Madness.
Yeah, pretty good. That we've actually had that for over a week now, and there's like one obscure crash that we can't quite pinpoint. It's very rare, and it also seems client side only. I don't know how that's possible. But aside from that, it's been surprisingly like easy to just play games. You know what I mean? Like we still have some like
DF did great work.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure compared to like integrating his extenders to GPTP was a pleasure compared to implementing Farty's unit like data extenders, basically.
The data extenders.
That was like a month-long project to even get it working, and we had so many issues. We had to.
Well, we still have issues now that are like downstream of it, right? So yeah, it's like I mean, those issues are mostly
and with
UI,
DF extenders, like all I had to do is like ask him a few questions, and he didn't even have to really answer me because I sort of. Yeah. Like by that point, I almost got it. So like, I think it was. The transport staff, it was like he told me what to do, and I actually got the idea what to do in the same time. So that was funny. And then there was something else. Oh yeah, he initially had to explain how the unit reference stuff works. It was like the weird unit reference arrays that are just offsets of the original array. It's just like an optimization that was done on the assembly by the compiler that compiled StarCraft, right? And it was really weird and confusing, but we figured it out, and he explained what it is.
Well, in general, DF stuff is always a joy to work with compared to other stuff. Like, I had gone from editing some mesh that in Blender that was just, like, basically objects stuffed into other objects. I think it was when I was editing the Cyclops, but I can't remember. But either way, I was doing some work in Blender, and then I swapped to his model, and I was like, oh, I can just select this. You know what I mean? Like, I can just like group select this, even though he didn't even make it in Blender. He made it in 3ds Max. So like, despite that, his topology is just much better than most other hard surface stuff that you can find on the internet. So I was like,
it's just when you apply booleans, everything breaks. So.
Well, no, in this case, it was like it was just separate objects that had been merged, but they were all like when you tried to loop select a bunch of like faces together, it would just select the whole thing or whatever. So it was just silly shit like that. But yeah, I don't know what his process is. All I know is that he made something that worked a lot easier out of the box. So I was appreciative of that. So
I sort of understand his like success with CMBW, like Brood War reverse engineering stuff. He's using Cheat Engine that I actually learned a bit recently too. It's really handy. It's it's better than the I used to sometimes work with Volley Debug, and Cheat Engine is just way better. And then I'm like. So previously, DF was like the cheat engine man, and I was like the IDA man, and now I sort of can use both tools. So that's pretty epic.
Yeah.
Although I'm sure he knows more about cheat engine still than I do. So, bye.
Well, he's also been using IDA fairly a lot recently for data mining, anyway. So like figuring out.
What that so is. I guess he's learning IDA. I'm learning cheat engine.
Yeah.
So.
Easy, dude.
It's pretty good.
It was nice to actually get those finally implemented. I still don't know how we haven't had to update A's or any of the other plugins for it. I suspect we'll find something missing in those eventually that needs to be corrected, but it's nice that the extenders have been implemented anyway. And
I don't know. AI doesn't seem to break horribly, so I mean it's the usual disaster. So
not yeah. I don't know that. I don't know what could have possibly killed it, but it doesn't seem related to this anyway. We also finally did the networking hook. I don't think we talked about it on Crow's Nest before, but basically there's this master hook that handles all inputs, and this has allowed us to track APM.
Parsing all inputs, and so I will sort of technically explain how this works. So first, Brood War receives inputs, then it processes those to like commands, and then the commands get sent over the network to all players, and then after they all get received, it's getting processed by game receive, which actually does like execution of all inputs basically, and that's actually the same process that Antikythera now uses.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I don't actually remember what order it was, but I feel like we had started to reverse engineer game receive before you did that. Is that true, or did you have the Antikythera's networking stuff done before?
I did networking first.
Okay, so
I knew about how the Brood War stuff works, though.
Oh, okay, yeah. It's a pretty simple system. It works pretty intuitively once you understand it. I mean, it's a couple extra steps than you might think is necessary, but that's only if you're kind of naive about how networking actually handles things. It's like you wouldn't want, especially for this kind of game, you wouldn't want to transfer like everything over the internet, right? You would just want to transfer the results so that and that's also why you can have,
actually
things, right?
You would be surprised because it's actually a bit more data to send processed commands than to send inputs, because when you like Antikythera used to send all the inputs unprocessed, like it would send the keys that were pressed, mouse that was like mouse position, mouse clicks. And it was actually super lightweight because I think the packet I weighted like below 30 bytes, I think. It was like really tiny.
Yeah, but don't you need to send the process commands? Because otherwise you can't have things like custom. I mean, I guess you could like unpack it with their config or something, but that doesn't seem like
you could, but that's a disaster. Yeah. I didn't want to deal with that. Its processed inputs are just they're like safer, they're technically more powerful.
Yeah.
You don't have to have fucking UI lag.
Oh right, yeah, that's right. Yeah,
like it's way
you can
better
do more client side things. That's true.
It's just a bit annoying to define it in C. No. And it would also be annoying to define in any like OOP language or whatever. They're the disaster too. But
porting Antikythera to Rust.
It would be JI.
I know,
but not yet.
Not yet. Thankfully, we are not ever going to touch Rust again unless we have to edit this stupid plugin for Brood War. I still can't believe it was chosen as a language for that. It's so silly. Well,
it uses almost no features of Rust.
No.
It actually is more likely that ICE causes some weird UB just because it's written in Rust, because the Rust compiler is the shittiest compiler ever. Once you actually not use any of the weird fucking borrow rules, it can do so much like weirdness. It's unbelievable. I've been I saw some guy compare like Rust to Zig a while ago and was like, he was dealing with some most insane UB just because he had to deal with a raw pointer. It's like so dangerous.
It's so dangerous. You might hurt yourself. Quick, put on all of this.
As actually, I feel like unsafe Rust is more dangerous than just normal C. So not worth it.
Yeah, of course. I mean, we know this, but apparently Linux users don't, because now they're in the drivers. So.
It's because some lunatics wanted Rust, and it wasn't as bad as C++, so they allowed it. I hope Linus comes to his senses and he bans it.
I hope nothing bad happens because of it, but this is 2023 and technology is terrible. So
yeah, it's like it started with renaming master to main. Disastrous change.
Yeah, no kidding. Because on top of that, it actually broke like I know it broke Reddit for a bit from what people were posting in the server. I'm sure it's broken a bunch of stuff.
It's terrible. It's just every new repo is cagged compared to the other ones.
Yeah, they're not Chads anymore. Speaking of Chads, we'll answer your questions later on in this episode. So if you got questions for the next episode, you should ask them. And yeah, with that, you want to get over to CMBW pacing as a subject?
Yeah, it's just I want to wrap up that March Madness is still being tested in pre-release, but it's like it feels pretty.
Yeah, I think I can
now.
push it.
I don't know.
After we're done recording this, I'll probably push it to the release. So.
Oh, okay, sure. And yeah, well, on that patch, we also have the pacing changes. We'll just talk about them now.
Yep. So CMBW pacing is obviously something that we're still trying to iron out. And again, a lot of it is so that we can research and figure out and innovate and experiment and all this other stuff to see if we have a good idea or a good grasp of, what, just a good understanding, like what changes are going to result in something that we want better. So obviously, one of the things that we did was we increased the harvest time. This allows you to actually have diminishing returns on the second worker on the node, because for a little bit now, you pretty much didn't lose any idle time at all. Like there was very little wait time before the second worker could harvest from the node. So you almost got like double efficiency from sending a second worker there. And that obviously does disincentivize you to expanding, because if you expand, then you transfer workers and then you think, okay, I'm going to get a very slight dip while my workers move and then I'll get an increase. But actually, it wasn't really that much better. You might as well just very slowly move workers instead of main-arding. And that's obviously pretty silly to do, because the whole idea is that like you're supposed to get an income boost. So that's one of the main reasons why we decided to go for an economic change to the harvesting time. We also, in the same breath, converted the units to use the iScript movement handling, which is basically like normal ground units. So anything that doesn't have acceleration, deceleration, etc., none of that sliding behavior. So workers no longer do that. There is unfortunately a really stupid bug where sometimes they can get stuck, because apparently the decollision is run differently if you're like an iScript based unit instead of a flingy based unit, which is what the deceleration is. So I don't know what causes that. As players, you can fix this by hitting stop on the unit, and that tells me that it's definitely something really silly. But obviously AI will just get hard stuck by this sometimes, especially if they decide to use the worker that's stuck to try to build something, because they will just never be freed. So we definitely need to fix this as soon as possible. But unfortunately, I have no idea what even could fix it. So we have to look into deceleration or decollision and how that works for ground units.
Yeah, and that change actually makes specifically the iScript change makes the workers harvest a bit faster than they used to, but the harvest
they move faster, right? So
yeah, the harvest time is set up such that basically the second worker has 50% efficiency.
Yeah.
So we are still actually like, if you would measure this system against the old system, you still get less money. So the pacing is slower now.
Yeah, but in tandem with this, we have increased the node count in every map, which means the pacing in the early stages of the game, you get less money, but you can scale your economy up to a higher degree by building more workers. So, right about now, things cap at around 26 to 30 workers probably on the average map for your main. And that's usually also true for your natural and maybe even your third base. And then, depending on the rest of the maps, you might see lower worker count or higher worker count or whatever. If it's a risky base, then maybe it's a super high worker count. But obviously that means that you have to spend more time to invest into it. And then on top of it, you have to like protect it against harassment more or something. It could also be the inverse, where it's like a very rich gas base or something, but not very many minerals or something like that. And so you end up building less max workers, but it's like more open and easier to attack. So anyway, there's also all that stuff that feeds into it. But the core idea was, making it so that it's valuable to expand, again, like more valuable anyway. And then obviously making it so that the game maybe scales up a little bit slower. Now, this has had sort of like weird results. Obviously, our initial hypothesis, you would think, is that if you slow down the rate of acquisition of resources in the early stages of the game, then you'll have a slower early game, and then that'll lead to more like thoughtful, maybe protracted openers where you're gonna, build a certain structure, and then you're gonna build a certain couple of units, and then like it takes you longer to hit all those breakpoints. But what we've actually found, at least so far in the very few tests that we've had, because obviously there's a very recent change in the last couple of days, what we've actually discovered is that people will build the same number of stuff, but they'll feel that much more desperate to like end the game early before the numbers get out of hand or whatever. So like what they'll generally see is like, because now it takes you an extra minute or whatever to get your, maybe it's like an extra 30 seconds or something to get your vulture out from the fulcrum, then you're like incentivized that much more to build the fulcrum like quickly with all your money instead of maybe doing a more defensive build. Now, maybe build orders are just going to adapt and adjust as people figure out this new system. But I've definitely noticed that like people are trying more desperate early aggression moves. And maybe it's just like they actually expect them to not be desperate, but they don't realize that they're actually all in and don't have much of a transfer because they've spent so much of their early economy on military instead of maybe trying to expand or building more workers or something like that. Like it could be many number of things, I guess, but those have been some initial observations. We're still figuring all that stuff out, so I expect.
Well, I had a hypothesis.
Okay.
Yeah, XD. So before we even implemented this, it was like day before. We haven't even thought about that. I had a hypothesis that, yeah, if you slow down the economy, you actually make everything riskier because now if you lose a unit, it's harder to like replenish them.
It represents a greater share of the money that you have.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So you get more opportunity costs. So your decisions early game are weighted even more.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know if it's possible to escape that because we're going from one system to another and we're comparing it to that old system. Whereas if this just existed like this the whole way through, or if you came into a new game like the one we're making with, you had to cast out, your ideas of what an economy was. Like if you didn't have a frame of reference of the same kind of game, which is obviously like CMBW continues to change and stuff. But like if you didn't think to your muscle memory of your old games, maybe you would just approach the game fundamentally in a safer way or, not as much immediate early aggro, at least not with like so many units or whatever. And so like maybe then it wouldn't feel like the decisions were as heavily weighted. And again,
I have a suspicion that your worker durability changes. So basically, you have increased the worker health.
Yes, I should point out it's 15 HP for each worker, and I also reduced their attack rates so that you are disincentivized to worker rush. Is my idea. We will see how those shape up.
So my suspicion is that actually helps because then if you lose a unit. Like you have this, let's say you're Protoss and you just like face Drakaden with Drakaden, you lose your Drakaden. My suspicion is that you would be able to edge like a worker or two probably with that win, right? Like it's not like game ending, but you'll get an edge because if the worker changes too. But then if you accumulate enough of an advantage, then you probably are cocked. Maybe that means we need more defender's advantage, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think the maps being a little bit safer now is probably helping with that anyway. There's a lot of things that we have to think about. I mean, that's almost one of the main reasons why I'm sure a lot of people have shied away from actually making changes to the formula. They just like copy and paste stuff and hope it works, right? And I was going to make this point earlier, but I can't remember. I think we were talking about we were talking about the battle reactions and how like if you're going to make a deviation from whatever Brood War has, then that doesn't mean you shouldn't be making deviations from Brood War. It just means you should probably figure out why you're doing that. Like, what problem are you going to solve? What things are you going to do differently? Like, we obviously remove supply and upgrades, and we're making radical changes to the formula. So, and this is also obviously going to carry through to our new stuff. Yeah, the Blizzard polish. It's gonna, we're gonna have very different games that we make compared to Brood War, but they're all built with an understanding of what actually is good about Brood War, or like what things about Brood War turn into, like what gameplay systems and decisions that Blizzard made and stuff result in, and all of that stuff. Like we understand that. We have an understanding of that, and it's important to note that. So the reason I'm pointing that out is like when it comes to the resources, when it comes to the durability, when it comes to all this stuff and like the, defender's advantage and whatnot, like we obviously have this existing game that's been play tested by pros to a ridiculous level. And we can compare to that and say like, okay, well, what could we be doing differently as players? But then also what could we be doing differently as like game designers, as map designers? Like there's so many aspects of it that I guarantee you that just seems very, very overwhelming and daunting to most people. And also that like that's why they just copy and paste stuff, right? Like that's why I guess those like purple war guys seem to have copy pasted StarCraft 2, but they want to be like Warcraft 3 aesthetically or something. And they have fucking grape stones as their resource, by the way. And then there's obviously like StarCraft 2, kind of cargo culty, obviously trying to be faster, more intense TM, and didn't really understand the like the outcome of a lot of their changes, and they admitted to as much by constantly going back on a lot of the changes they made and then re-implementing them later or whatever, and not really knowing what the difference was made or what have you.
Well, they never reverted the worker count change, and I'm not actually sure if it was that good of a change.
No, of course it wasn't. It just removed any semblance of early game. That's the faster, more intense shit, right? It was already faster and more intense TM than Brood War, but with the 6 workers, right? So doubling the worker count doesn't do anything other than make the games end in like 4 minutes.
Well, I think it mostly removed some cheeses, really, but the game is already really fast. It scales really quickly. It has extremely low TTK. It's extremely based on spellcasters.
Yeah, you can get like, I mean, all you need to know is that you can get like a battle cruiser in like 5 minutes in that game, so. Or like a Thor in 4:30.
Yeah, but those units aren't even that powerful, so
I know they're not, but I mean, like that's their end game tech, and they can speed run it to like at that time. Like you'll be lucky if you're halfway to tier 2 by 5 minutes or 6 minutes in CMBW, and that's sort of intentional. It's like, well, maybe not lucky. Maybe that's actually normal around like 6 minutes to be halfway there or whatever. But you get the idea. It's like you're not guaranteed to have tier 2 by anything earlier than like 10 to 12 minutes in the average game. And that's by design. It's so that you actually have time to feel out tier 1, feel out what your opponent is doing, and like figure out what's going on there, right? So I do think that the durability changes will make it less easy to immediately destroy everything and less easy to snipe a bunch of workers and thus get a huge advantage. The attack rate nerfs makes them less useful as damage dealers, but obviously the durability increases make them more useful as tanks, which means you can imagine like some Droleth pulls with like three Droleths being pulled off the mineral line and like 2 Quasilisks and them fighting off some early aggression, right? Or whatever, or like making it hard to click on the Zethicors to snipe them. I guess the auto attack priority would help you with that, but like you get the idea. It's like there's things you can do with these units that is still useful. And it just makes them more of like a frontline tank role. And, people are hypothesizing, oh, maybe you could actually pull a couple for tanking. And in the early game, if you wanted to do some sort of like devastating early rush or an all-in or something, and you could, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. They are slower than they used to be, even though they return resources faster because they don't turn around. They don't decelerate when they're finishing their movement. They are slower with their top movement.
Yeah, and they don't have to accelerate either.
Yeah. They are slower with their top movement speed than before, so when moving long distances uninterrupted, they will be slower. That's also going to factor into scout timing and stuff. So, yeah, I mean, there's other changes we can make. We can increase the base cost of each individual like production structure. I don't know that wouldn't have the same effect we're concerned about, where like it makes the early game more fragile, even though we're trying to slow down the early game. Like the fact that you have to spend more money and you have less money in order to access military means that like you might end up getting owned in that way, right? So I don't know 100% what the solution to that is. Like I don't want it to take a minute to build a single production structure. You know what I mean? So I mean that seems like it's out the window. So if we wanted to decrease the amount of time or increase the delay before the first production structure becomes operational, then we would have to do it through resource cost changes. And if we do that, then it might just be too excessive for the point that like you can't actually adapt in time or something, right? That's the main thing that I get concerned about. But, there's also the open question is, should it actually be viable to go, command center first or something? Like, I don't know if it should be. And maybe it is right now. We just haven't seen it in action, right? So, and maybe it's fine if it is viable, but like you're just, fragile. And if your opponent scouts it, you can get punished. Like that's how it is in Brood War. And I think that's probably fine. So.
Yeah, I think the base it's basically. I feel like it's positive when like the baseline is in the middle, because if you make it always the base choice to like fast expand, like it's in StarCraft 2, then you just always have that. If it's always like if the baseline needs to be aggressive and like even taking an expo in like 7 minutes is risky, then like you would always just be aggressive. It's like good to have options. Basically, you have like some middle thing as the baseline, like maybe like some infantry, some expoing, Like the combination is like the baseline, and then like you can choose to be riskier and try to cut a bit on military, and you just like you either bet on the fact that you scouted something and you're not in danger, or you bet on the fact that you have enough of a micro skill to hold off any push.
You
And
could
then
also
you can
bet
also
on your
be
military, right? You can do the opposite of what you were saying, which is
you can be aggressive, right?
stay at aggro, stay at like military for longer, try to get an advantage that way. And even if they kill your early wave, you might have done enough eco damage to their natural that they're no longer harvesting many resources from it. Especially considering they'd probably transfer workers from their main because of our diminishing returns worker changes.
Yeah, basically, like the game is. I think that's actually true of any multiplayer game. Is like you just have continuous negotiations with the other player. You're basically trying to get more value than he is. Like you want to net more stuff, basically.
Yeah.
So you're trying to gain as much without losing, like with losing as little, and also trying to make him lose as much and gain as little as possible. And that's basically like the game theory basis, I guess, for any game with like hostile forces, I guess.
Right. Any sort of player versus player game, we could say. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think we can experiment and continue to like see how this evolves out. It'll definitely give us some useful insight and instructions for how to proceed with our first game in Antikythera. So I'm happy that we've made the change. Obviously, there are some like rough edges, like I was talking about the worker bug for workers getting stuck or whatever, that we're going to need to resolve, and hopefully we can do so in short order. Beyond things that are related to Brood War being a buggy mess and us not being able to access any source code for it, I think in general, like it's a pretty smart idea to explore this sort of thing and see where it leads us.
Oh, it's definitely good to have diminishing returns.
Yeah.
And it's just like we've been dealing with like workers, like workers have no collision, so they will just stack on each other, so it's sort of hard to count them. And I actually found like some when I was like playtesting, and I playtest less than you, but I've been able to like transfer stuff more like pretty reliably without much hassle. But it's just like you have to like there are just some like usability stuff that could have been better.
The problem is you need to select. Well, you don't need to, but it would be ideal to select workers that are only harvested, like on the return. But you're not guaranteed to select only one worker that's working one field because now you have diminishing returns, right? So like two workers will be on the same field. One of them will be halfway done harvesting, and the other one will have just arrived to wait. And with that being the case, it's like I might accidentally strip out all workers on a single node when trying to transfer, and then I have to like figure that out at a glance, and it can be quite difficult.
Oh, I was just grabbing them from under the town hall, and then I was just doing manual corrections if something didn't. Like I would like grab like, so when they're returning, I would just grab like 8 or something. I would transfer them, and then if I see a double or something, like a double node, I would just make that be corrected.
Yeah.
And
well,
it's
it's not as easy as you're making it sound, because sometimes they don't return at the same time. So
yes, so it's like it's nuanced, but it's definitely more difficult than it used to be. And I don't know if that's really that valuable. And
I don't think it's a useful skill. It's just like, I mean,
efficiency with your actions is sort of useful, but should it be here? I don't know. Like I've been feeling like the early game before you actually build a building is actually sort of neat, because now you have to like sort of manage the work. It's like more gratifying version of what normal Brood War had, where you had to like fight the Wandering. Now you just have to actually just allocate the workers. It's like at a higher scale, it's sort of more difficult. But then I guess you don't care as much about precision that much, because if you miss one worker, it's not the end of the world.
Well, thankfully, our wandering does kick in after there are two workers trying to harvest the same patch. So, like, the third worker will decide, I'm going to go somewhere else. It's just not like they might go to a lower yield one than you wanted or something. So, it still rewards you to be on the ball with that. But yeah, if you don't have the ability to spare the APM, then it will sometimes be a bit taxing. What I have noticed is I've just tended to start rallying from every town center I have on one control group into the new base and not bother like changing any workers from one base because it's just like, oh, I already set that base up. I don't want to have to redo it. So I'm just going to like, and that's obviously slower than because you don't get the immediate spike.
I assume what you would do is what I was sort of just like, I would take the latest saturated base, I would grab half the workers from it, transfer it to the new base, and then like rally some workers here and some workers there, and that would work.
You know, something. Here's an idea that just came into my head, which might be useful for like this might be perceived as some sort of simplification or automation, but something I just thought of is I think in StarCraft 2 this happens visually where it actually differentiates units you have selected, like they become brighter in color or something than units on the minimap than units that you don't have selected. And I was just thinking, if you select, say, you've got 3 town centers in one control group, and you press the control group to recall that selection, and not only do they light up or whatever to some degree, but they also, you can hold shift and then left click on the minimap to like deselect one. I thought that would be kind of neat. Like, I don't know if it would make sense because you might not want to select units through the minimap specifically. Like, I find that to be silly. But if I can deselect like one on the bottom, say I have like 2 bases that are close to a third base that I'm taking, and I only want one of them to rally there, then like I could deselect the one I don't want to rally there or something. I don't know. Maybe it's not that useful, but it's just something that occurred to me that we might be able to experiment with an Antikythera in the future. But these are just
so you would want deselecting through the minimum.
Yeah, like, well, I don't really know because at the same time I was thinking about it, and we had this conversation before where like, should you be able to select units to the minimap? I think you might have suggested this a while ago.
Yeah, I was thinking that was my suggestion that like I was actually just like floating it because I knew it's probably like it would morph the game a lot and it would be something.
Yeah, it's just like it turns it into the Supreme Commander thing where you're just selecting shapes on a giant map that's like a small abstraction of what you're actually fighting over, and it's like, well, I actually want you to make intimate and meaningful decisions about individual units while looking at them. Like the individual representation matters. So. Yeah, I'm not really a big fan of that. So,
well, you sort of can do that already with selecting a control group and a moving through a minimap, right?
Well, yeah, but you're not selecting units on a minimap. You're recalling a control group that you selected in the game. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like I can see your point about what's equivalent, but it's not really equivalent because you're not just defining a new selection from the minimap alone, right? Yep. The minimap actually has nothing to do with it. It's totally like it's orthogonal in that sense. Meanwhile, somebody has said, just remake Warcraft 3, but in Chromium, and I think that's a great point to end this topic on.
They did.
Yeah, they didn't remake Warcraft 3, but they did make it in Chromium, I'll tell you that much. Good old Five Nations. Yeah, well. Should we do Chad questions, or should we talk about games we played recently? What do you think? Which one?
I'm just thinking if I had any more thoughts on the pacing, and then we can do... I guess chat questions first, probably.
Okay.
What we can do.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on the pacing? I'm excited to see it in action. There are some spots I consider rough right now, and I'm not sure how we'll yet resolve it. But I'm not going to make any dramatic changes until we've tested these ones because these ones are already pretty dramatic.
Yeah, I feel like if you get like, I have a suspicion that getting used to those, it can actually feel really good. I sort of felt really good when I played versus AI, but I haven't played. I don't think I played any games versus humans.
Not with this change, no.
No.
We played a couple versus AI games. You played a couple for testing. I played versus the Shambler, and aside from one meme map that had 6 mineral fields, so it was unplayable. I did notice it was a lot of spanking where we were just. I think I can't remember. One of them was like he crashed because of some pylon change I made, and I fixed that. But like the others were, we just very quickly he lost within like 10 minutes still, and that was before we walked back the harvest time a little bit, but then made the iScript movement change, so that was like a little bit earlier. Anyway, it was still like, oh, we're both playing it out, and we're both like accidentally going very all in or something. You know what I mean? Like that was sort of what I was commenting on.
Yeah.
That's
I was actually, so what I wanted to mention is before we even discovered the diminishing return problem, is I was thinking that it would actually be really good for pacing. that if we would speed up the economical stuff and basically slow down the tech stuff, I was also suggesting I had something to experiment with some other game maybe or whatever, but it's like I was suggesting that maybe the economical scale would scale faster, so then you would have more of tier 1. So you would actually have bigger armies, bigger stuff, more production. You would.
Yeah.
I was suggesting like higher time cost to production, so like to units actually. So you need more production to to like efficiently produce from them.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like trying to propose something that is like way more way more scale and like economical pace, but also the tech would be way pricier. That's actually something I think that we also like floated in the server where we like started saying like oh April 1st we'll do that or something.
Yeah, I was saying literally double the income, but like quintuple the tech cost or something. That's a joke.
Yeah.
I don't know. So most of what you said is something we're going to be default experimenting with in the first game anyway. Like if you think about the tech pacing in the first race, which you're obviously familiar with, it is analogous to your suggestion of like Huracan and Cyprian are unlocked by an add-on or whatever. The difference being that obviously you can't really do that in Brood War or in CBW because like the races weren't designed with that from the ground up, right? Whereas they are in this game. So like the one race that has that particular flourish is very much designed with that in mind. So then we can have like maybe we can like conceptually I think the training times are very similar to CMBW. So we can obviously adjust that there with the idea that like we're feeding into this. An observation I'll have immediately is that I do feel like just like the smaller amount of income makes you feel like maybe you have like each individual unit is more significant because it's a more significant chunk of your resources or whatever. Therefore, losing it is even more significant. I do feel like that will still be the same case here, except instead of money, it's time. It's like a larger, each unit representing a larger portion of your time income.
But that's why I wanted this to be like in tandem with like the economical stuff where like, oh, the game actually allows you to have more, like you would have bigger compositions, bigger armies, so it would just take you more of a setup too, and like the base management stuff would be slower basically, but the military pace would be higher, where you would actually see more tier 1 in tier 1.
Yeah, and I mean that's sort of what I'm going for in CMBW anyways, the idea that you stick at tier 1 for a little bit longer, just because like you made the observation, I think it was even in the last episode of Crows, or 2 episodes ago maybe, that right now you just kind of run away from tier 1. I mean, that seems to be your take. I actually like a lot of the tier 1 options, but I would imagine a lot of people feel like, you know, maybe they're not as confident in their micro or something, and so they're like, yeah, actually tier 1 isn't for me. I'm gonna
it's like I try to stay on tier 1 and then I get cacked because like for like a small enough initial cost, I can get way better units, and it's just like it's sort of also hard to compete with some units because of like the armor system being out of whack a bit right now, where we have high armor values on almost everything. Like I'm exaggerating, of course, but you've been talking about it with Masquerade. So.
Yeah, I mean there might be a stat crunch at some point. That's another very large scale change. I guess it's orthogonal enough to the economics that we probably could do it safely without worrying, but I just haven't shed enough brain power for that particular thing yet. I'm still very much focused on like this game we're working on in Antikythera. So maybe it's something to do after the pitch or something. Anyway,
let's do chat questions now.
Chat questions. It's different than chat questions because it is in a chat channel in our Discord server, but
did I say chat? Or
I don't know. It sounded like chat, but it's probably just your accent. Don't worry.
Yeah.
We got the first question from Keyan. So, I mean, if you guys don't know, by the way, if you donate to us on Coffee, the lowest tier imaginable is the question and answer tier, Q3A. So, ask question, get answer kind of deal. And you have to be on Discord to do it. Although, actually, that's not true because
one
Rob...
coffee a month and we give you one question a month. An episode, I guess.
Yeah.
Actually. So.
It would be an episode. 1 per person, although I guess we're kind of cheating because Myrion asks 2 here, but generally 1 per person. So, we'll get there. And yeah.
Since we don't have money, that's fine for now, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how, like, the second question is that he asks. We'll get there. I don't know if I'll answer it in too much detail. So Keyan asks, I am curious if any Xibalba regencies will have unique methods of harvesting resources, e.g. some factions cap resources, some factions don't cap resources, but have other methods of increasing yield. Some factions don't have any ways to increase yield, but maybe can reduce some cost factor of their production or units. So it's kind of interesting because I immediately think of that last sentence about like reducing the cost factor of their production or units is like, it reminds me of CMBW Zerg with the Kafralosk and the Gathalosk, where the Kafralosk cuts out the middleman for the advanced tier strains. So like in Brood War, you've got Hydralisk into Lurker. Well, imagine if you could just get Lurker from the larva. That's sort of like the equivalent of what the Kafralosk enables you. And then the Gathalosk just gives you double the units, so you get 2 Hydras instead of going straight to Lurker or whatever. So that's something that we already have an example of. Xibalba is obviously the setting where CM Retail, Cosmonic Retail, will be placed, and it has a whopping 20 regencies currently planned. I say currently because I might be insane enough to want to do more in the future, but we'll see. And also, in fairness, like some of them might end up not working for RTS or whatever, and I end up leaving them as not playable or whatever, and like just have them be aspects of the setting. But we'll see. Like that's another we'll see, right? It's very far into the future. So he was curious about like how that would work. I guess my initial point is that I would really like for the economics of the game to behave identically for all regencies, in the sense that like everybody uses workers to harvest resources. And there's going to be some things that are different about that. Like the workers' weapon range is actually also their harvest range, is a current idea that I have, which means you'll have ranged workers that harvest from a range. And then obviously there's going to be flying workers, just like in CMBW. And because flying units actually have collision, that's not overpowered, since they'll still have to like leave enough space for themselves and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, I guess flying ranged workers would be super OP if you actually microed them, because you would like micro them close to the unit or something, like, you know what I mean? So that's kind of silly. And I guess that also applies to ranged units as well, since you could like have more of them. Because right now, the only thing that limits conceptually anyway, the only thing that limits workers from harvesting is if you can fit the worker on near the node at the same time. So you can have like multiple workers simultaneously harvesting. We might find that that's actually very problematic. So.
I'm curious how we can get appropriate diminishing returns from that system, because like
right now it's just pathing based.
It's like, yeah, if they collide with each other or something dumb.
Yeah.
But that's really inconsistent. So
we would want it to be consistent, of course. And then we also don't even really yet know how we're going to place the resources. Like right now, I've just decided I'm going to place them kind of far away. And then you just build your resource depot wherever, because there's no minimum distance required, unlike in Brood War. So you build your town center like anywhere, just wherever, and it works. And obviously, you want to leave enough room for your units to move around in, and so that's why you would build it maybe a little bit.
Do we have unbuildable terrain in Antikythera? I don't think we do, right?
Cliffs, probably, right?
Yeah, but they aren't. Like, that's not what I mean. Because, like, we would just place crevices.
Yeah. There's certain spots where we would specifically we would specifically place unbuildable terrain. I don't think it exists yet. I mean, we don't have the ability to place, like, doodad. Well, I guess we have doodads, but we don't have, like, center tiles that... Like, we don't have that conception yet, so we can't, like, copy and paste center tiles in the middle of wherever. We have to place them as an isometric diamond.
Yeah, it's because I have... The technical reason is for that is that we randomize the entire thing when we want to generate some stuff. So, like, if you would make manual edits, it would break. And if you would flag it as locked, it would break the other stuff then.
Yeah, it just needs to be redone at some point in the future, so that's fine.
Yeah, that too.
Yeah, so anyway, my short answer to this question is, as far as unique methods of harvesting resources, I mean, there obviously, like, I think it was the Rhazellium sort of make a comment about this in their description. The Avot also will do this, where it's like they will repurpose the corpses, recycle the corpses or whatever into resources. I don't yet know if that's going to be significant, because it's kind of like, it's a cool idea, but in practice, it might turn into this thing that's either really good or so niche as to not be useful. Like, I guess every like lame scrub noob designer's idea would be like, oh man, if I enter into a base trade and I lose my base and I recycle corpses into resources, I can build a new base. And it's like, yeah, that happens in like one game out of 10,000, buddy. So it's like not very meaningful and probably not something you should like balance the entire race around or whatever. So anyway, like
and
that's
also
something good
like
happen.
I think it's a fail as a designer if you don't see that like everything is a resource basically. So if you think that getting a resource for a corpse is insane, for example, like haven't you just like lost your mind as a designer basically? Because like every race has different resources and every race has to utilize them differently, and it's like the interactions between races are different like
well, even
in
health is a
relation to those
resource. You know
resources.
what I mean? Like, you
Yeah.
know, the
I mean,
number
that's
of units
actually
you have and stuff.
pretty simple to understand.
Yeah.
And also like corpses being a resource or whatever. Like positionality is a resource, like map control is
Yeah.
a resource, tempo is a resource, like the behaviors you have access to is a resource, the tech availability is a resource. So like
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Keyan's
so much
question is
stuff.
geared specifically towards resources that you harvest directly
Yeah,
to
yeah,
use
it's just
on money.
it's
But
like a comment towards the like a baby designer would be afraid of doing this, right?
well, no, the strawman designer I was giving as an example is the opposite, where he's like, "Oh, this is so epic," but it actually doesn't do anything. So, like, that's sort of what I was saying.
Yeah.
Like, it could turn into one of those situations where you're like imagining this really epic case, but you don't imagine. For one, it doesn't happen very often. For another, it might not actually be
Yeah, I
as
bet they
impactful.
would even balance the game around that reaction, which would be very silly.
I don't know. It's definitely strange. I don't mind leaving a lot of gameplay and design space around like things that happen rarely. I don't mind that at all. Like it's the equivalent of, you know, in Counter-Strike you have the bomb sites which have and the approaches to the bomb sites, but then you have all this like these little nooks and crannies you can stick behind inside the spawns or like around the corner from the spawns, and it's like, yeah, you can save there. Like maybe that happens once a game, if that, or whatever. But you know, that's neat. It's like, you know, these little off angles and strange things you can do to, you know, spruce up the map or like change things up. And like, that's in some ways where emergent gameplay happens. So I don't mind allowing for that as a designer. It's just not what I would focus something as core as harvesting resources around. So
yeah,
I think the short answer is I'd probably keep everything the same as far as like you always using workers to harvest resources. Maybe there's an outside chance you could do something like the Talos salvage in CMBW where you're like deconstructing a unit or something. There might be like a few cases like that, but it certainly wouldn't be the primary way of getting resources. It would be something on top of it. And I also don't know if it would end up being super impactful. Like it would probably be an experiment in many ways, right? So
some games actually have buildings passively harvesting nearby resources. That might be something interesting to at least consider, but I don't know if it will actually make it.
Yeah, a lot of games also have buildings that generate resources from nothing. This is something that Mesk wanted to include a lot in his work. I personally don't think it's super interactive because the buildings. I mean, he had a bunch of wild ideas where it was like, if you destroy that building, it might cause like a subnuclear explosion that damages a lot of other stuff around it or something. So you have to like, but also there might be some reason where you would want to build it near the rest of your other stuff too. So it's like very risky or whatever. And obviously it would be very expensive. So that's like to avoid the hypothetical situation where you just hurtle up. And like these would take up a huge amount of terrain space as well and whatnot. But I'm not 100% sold on the idea that it would work is all. So that's just my personal skepticism.
It depends how it's done, right? Like because it can be just flat static passive income, right? Like where it just comes like, oh, you get 1 mineral a second or something.
Yeah.
And the trade-off is it takes a lot of space and it can be destroyed, and like you said, like maybe it deals damage or something. There also is one other model that is actually probably even more toxic, which is like an interest thing, where you like multiply your resources by a small interest rate, where you like get something depending on the. And that is actually really toxic because it makes you want to bank up money.
It makes you want to not spend the money, which is actually the opposite. Like, unless you're banking for, you know, buying tech up in CMBW, you're not really supposed to not spend your money. You know what I mean? Like, spend your money, man. That's a big deal. So, Yeah, like that's kind of antithetical to what an RTS is. So. Yeah, anyway, hopefully that was a satisfactory question.
Yeah. And I actually had another question that I know that Myrion will appreciate is actually about, I believe, Rhazellium, right? They're the self-replicating.
Yeah, the ones that
yeah. So I was thinking about it while I was off the call doing something else. I was thinking, it's actually very interesting. How would you even make a Rhazellium campaign? How would you present them? Like, you can't really have dialogue, right? Like, maybe you do, but like, how would you tackle that?
Yeah, so the Rhazellium communicate using they have these sort of control nodes, and these are called Serasil, and you can get all of this information and more in the Xibalba description and documentation. But so the Rhazellium have these control nodes, which, as it said on the page, they update the protocols of scrap collection. By the way, all of their operations are considered to be scrap collection because they're just consuming everything in their path, pretty much deconstructing planets and all this other shit. You imagine there'd be quite the rivalry between them and the Thruk, and if you know what the Thruk are, then you know what's up with that. But yeah, so the Rhazellium obviously have their own specializations that they have when they do the harvesting. These are also how you would tech up in some way, is my idea anyway, is this would be based on so the window dressing / lore, if people are familiar with the Ember Seat are this group of a bunch of lesser factions and powers, and they've made this coalition so that they can maybe survive in the face of all of these superpowers relative to them individually. And so this coalition basically has representatives of each one of the member nations and races, and you tech up by building embassies of the various kinds that you want that unlock various units. And so you have two systems that are interlinked but kind of branching in some capacity, where one of them dictates the immediate tech you can afford, which is your total embassy count, or representative count. And then the other one is what kinds of units you can build with the structures you can afford. And that's okay, say I have a tier 3 production structure, I can only train units from that production structure that correspond to the race of the embassies that I have. So if I have embassies for 2 nations, those are the only 2 nations that I can train units for, basically. So it's kind of I have something similar in a way planned for the Rhazellium, where their method of teching up is actually doing some sort of protocol on their production structures, which and also on their other structures as well. And that protocol would actually be an if this, then else that, or whatever, where you're actually making decisions based on what you want. We sort of talked about this. I don't remember if it was on a Crow's Nest or not. With the Onitar game, one of the ideas we had was maybe we would make it so that your production structure, say you have a barracks, and you can switch the barracks to have a certain mode for I want to swap my Mavericks and get a different unit instead of Maverick from the barracks, but only for this barracks, and I have to pay for that premium or something. And so that kind of system is probably how the Rhazellium are going to handle things. But the reason why I'm talking about their gameplay impact is because the Serasil obviously have a set dressing, window dressing impact. The lore of how you're optimizing things or changing things is that you are updating the scrap harvest protocol for whatever you're doing. And so that also will dictate onto the units themselves, I believe, as well. I'm not 100% sure how that's going to all chain down. I guess it would probably be something I'm going to do it in a different way, obviously, but Dawn of War had equipment for individual units that changed their capabilities, gave them some sort of special behavior or whatever. I think units trained from production structures with different protocols would probably also have that. But I'm not yet sure if that's the angle I want to go for the Rhazellium. But the Serasil are also important in the lore because the Rhazellium will be they're the ones that will be basically giving you your harvest protocol orders, right? And so they don't really have an individuality necessarily. They don't have personality. They're not really this guy, they don't have names even. They might have a call sign or something that I can make clever anagrams of or something. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but in general, they're not really, they might have a model number or something, but they're not necessarily going to have a name or an identity. And as a result, they will not really have the opportunity to develop into genuine characters. So what you would want is instead the Rhazellium would be very consistent with how they behave and how they speak, and they would be they have to communicate to the other races, so they would have to have developed some way of external speech, which is sort of the conceit that I would get around for them issuing orders to each other. You would be translating that for the player as if they were speaking it normally or whatever. And that's how you would have dialogue between like, the Cerasil communicating information between each other so that they can reach a better conclusion as to what to do and how to proceed. So that's sort of how I would handle that. And on top of it, of course, there would definitely be a lot of interplay with other regencies, because otherwise you wouldn't necessarily be able to have all of the useful and interesting interactions that you would normally want to have in the context of a campaign, right? So there's got to be some conceits or some constraints to the narrative design or whatever to make it work for this race, but it's definitely workable, and it's definitely something that I've given thought to.
Yeah, pretty epic.
And it's very similar to Myrion's actual question, which is why I know you mentioned that. He was saying discussing your campaign and co-op mission design would be nice. That was his first question. And so I'll actually give you the floor for this one, because you've obviously seen some of the campaigns, the designs or otherwise that I've gotten. You've worked with me on a few maps before. You kind of sort of know a little bit about how I like to construct stuff. So for this, and you obviously are familiar with the plans we have for tutorials, not just in our first game, but also in the CMBW campaigns, the CM retail campaigns as well. So do you have any particular observations or initial interesting points you want to make? Because this question is very open-ended.
Yeah, sure.
So.
I just don't want to, I wouldn't want to butcher your designer intentions or anything, so correct me when I'm wrong.
Sure.
But it's the way the no fraud formula
sure
seems to be to actually have gameplay. I know it's shocking.
Yes.
But we do things gameplay first, and then it's story first too, but it's not an expensive gameplay. So basically you have a storytelling that is not trying to grab your attention away from gameplay, it's just trying to augment it, where you will get short, very concise, and accurate dialogue during the missions, and you will actually get a lot of tasteful things mentioned that you will have to replay maybe to really understand. I know Darian is not really afraid of mentioning something. The first briefing or whatever, you will just have something that you will not really understand. You will have to guess what it may mean, and then when you actually replay it later, you will actually have this eureka, oh, this actually makes a lot of sense or whatever. That's something I know is done. And
the dialogue specifically is it's just characters talking to each other, and they don't necessarily make it convenient to with a complete it's not an annotated description where they say they might say this proper noun, and then they say the thing that we use to use this other action or whatever. It's no, they don't actually say that second part, because it's kind of understood what that proper noun might be, and hopefully it's named something that's thematic enough.
Right?
Yeah. Ideally, the dialogue has whatever mystifying proper nouns there might be as an example. Ideally, there's enough context clues to understand what it might be, and stuff like that is really important, right? So if you recognize, oh, there's this thing I don't understand, but the characters are talking about it very matter-of-factly, and they're in this context, the more they say it, the more you'll understand what it is. And also, if it ends up being represented at any point, and it's not just some ambivalent reference to some aspect of the lore that they never get to, then that's even better, because you'll actually have a concrete example of what it is. But you might not ever need a dictionary definition or a glossary or a wiki or whatever to understand what that stuff is. You might just understand it based on the dialogue, and then when you come back and replay it as you're saying, you're oh yeah, that actually makes total sense. They're talking about this thing, and the more they talked about it, the more I understood what the context was and what it might be for sure. The more clear it all became. And just doing that instead of being as you know, we need this to do that is it's just so lame and boring. And yeah, for sure, having a little bit more nuance and a little bit more substance to what's being said it just goes a long way to making you feel this is part of a world and these characters have an agenda and they do things, right?
Yeah, and the thing about characters is that their personality is also reflected in gameplay, and that's actually really neat. It's sort of similar how we talked about this bunker lift up thing where oh, this makes Terrans feel like Terrans. They are Crowley and whatever. Mm-hmm. So we would have that for characters though, where they would have this character where, oh, I'm conservative, so I will take the bases safely. I will not attack or whatever.
Yeah. I'll be the
And
slow
that's
crawler or whatever. Yeah.
Sort of seems to be what we have been doing, although we haven't been really doing story stuff like very recently. But that's always like sort of what we had, and we're like, even like in Deliverance, we sort of wanted to have done, right?
Yeah, and I mean, even in the birthday maps that we make is like, or like a very simple example is that there's supposed to be a very specific figure from Luciferius's past who is represented in his birthday map that I just released earlier today, the 27th of March. And that person really likes to build Goliaths. And I'm sure that Luciferius can guess who that person actually is. But a simple thing to do to represent that through gameplay, I mean, like, that's obviously like something that's tied in, like his personality is he likes Goliaths. But it's more like, his personality is he likes whatever the Goliath can do for him. And so he builds more units that can do what the Goliath can do for him. So it's not just Goliath. He also builds like Paladins and Penumbra and stuff. But like those are some preferences that he, exemplifies in his gameplay. And so that's a very simple, like nuts and bolts version. But you would imagine, and I think I've given this example before, but I can't remember where, that in the tutorial for CM Retail that introduces you to how the game works and like basic control scheme functions and stuff. For one, your character that you're following, like the protagonist of that tutorial, is actually being plugged into a command matrix, which is then being explained by a veteran commander of that faction. So you have a lot of reasons for why there's actual explanation as to what the UI is, which is pretty good because it means that it's all in universe and you don't have to be like, narrator, go here with your units to shrink the fog of war. It's like, no, we just have like an actual explanation for like an in-universe stuff, right? So it's pretty good in that respect. Then on top of it, the opponent that you have sees it as like disrespectful to his abilities to have to sit here and fight like training, basically act as a training dummy for the opposing force, right? So it's like he's thinking of it like this is an insult. I'm not going to sit around and just like let this baby commander, like practice against me. So I'm just going to give them a real ass whooping. And that context will have been established in like the opening cutscene or whatever for that mission. So it'll all be in universe. And the way that this guy exemplifies his anger and frustration and his general aggression is by just like blindly rushing you, like ridiculous amounts of units. And, you have good defender's advantage. So it's going to be pretty easy for you to neutralize his early attack almost automatically. Like you won't really have to do too much. And we also won't going to be like, go up this ramp to get defender's advantage. No, we're just going to be like, have maybe start you with some units on the ramp and that'll be enough of an indication. And, maybe the mechanical aspect of like the fact that units get range, sight range and attack range increases on the height advantage or whatever, that will be explained to you in universe, right? It's like, they from this vantage point, units can attack farther away, or your soldiers can attack from farther away, like some in-universe dialogue line, right? So I think that's a big deal. It also allows you to actually have like the AI's personality be the character's personality, so like they're in sync with each other. You mentioned like it's gameplay first, but it's also story first, and that's because we're using the gameplay as a vehicle for storytelling.
Yeah, well, you're using them in tandem, right?
Yeah, like they work together, and
that seems to not be the case for most games, which is really weird.
Well, I mean, you always intrinsically know this because, like, if they ever have to wound your character in an FPS after you've, like, been shot a bunch of times and healed with a med kit or something, then they'll do it in a cutscene where you can't control your character. And it's like, oh, I guess this is the part of the game that's very different than the part of the game I was just playing because, I mean, for one, it's not gameplay, but for another, it's also, like, it's using different rules completely. Like, Mesk and I were talking about trailers being completely disconnected. And I gave the example of, like, when the Sycora show up with some sort of cloaked or otherwise concealed threat in a trailer shot, the version of that would be like Antikythera, who had been fighting some other threat because like a big portion of the trailers is going to be like really emphasizing the free for all aspect of all the different factions. So like all the trailers I have in my head are like the cinematic trailers have all of like many different factions showcased in one trailer, but they're all like kind of fighting each other, or maybe some of them are fighting alongside each other or whatever. And so like there's like Antikythera fighting Keltar, and then the Sycora show up in the middle of that fight to like see if they can, get their own foothold in the area. And because the protocol was like there's a front line versus the Keltar, and those are like your durable units as the Antikythera, and then your ranged units are in the back. And then when it becomes obvious that Sycora are about to show up, what happens is that the melee units start to form a circle of protection around the ranged units such that they can be set up properly for the fight, because that's actually going to be how you fight against Sycora with positioning in game. And so even in the trailer, we're reinforcing that. It's like, I don't understand why this is so difficult for the average developer to understand. But if you actually show like true to form gameplay expressions in the trailers that you have, it's not going to come across as like dishonest. It's not even going to come across as like, wow, they really had to do it exactly like the game. Like, no, people are going to really respect that. They're going to really they're going to vibe with that a lot more. Like when their expectations are set correctly.
I was always of put how like StarCraft 2 has this where like units will behave differently. Like you always bring this example from Brood War where carrier like glasses the planet, right?
It glasses some Terran harvesting craft, which also doesn't exist. Like the weapon or behavior that the carrier shows is not in the game, and the unit that is destroyed by that behavior is also not in the game.
Well, now it is. It's Star Sovereign.
Yes, yeah. In CMBW, we have
yeah, in StarCraft 2, I remember like cutscene units in cutscenes were completely different. Like I think Mutalisks were spitting like some green thing, and then
they had an acid spray attack in the beta.
They have shurikens or whatever.
Yeah, they have glaive worms.
It's like I don't remember the exact examples, but I know like the lore things are completely out of whack compared to the in-game things. Where like it's technically like, oh, this is like a ghost and goes to this, but this ghost actually does this. Like, why? Why is it all so confused?
Yeah. Or I actually don't mind in some respects the idea that you might have like orthogonal things about unit lore that, like maybe you can argue this is like a weakness of a unit if it has lore aspects that aren't really useful in battle or aren't related to how it works in battle or something. I can see that as like additional, facts that help you reinforce like if you know this information, then you just get something more clearly about how that faction works. Like there was the example of the Ascozi as one of the subfactions of the Ember Seat, and their way of hijacking is actually to like biologically reassemble as the thing that they're trying to turn. Like they basically become whatever they're hijacking for a temporary amount of time, and it's like that's due to like extended gene therapy, but also experimentation and stuff, right? And so that's what the Ascozi hijacking is like. It's very strange, and that's also how I explain how it can work for mechanical targets or biological targets and non-biological targets, since you can hijack like a mechanical thing by like piloting it, but how does it work at all if you're hijacking it by like, what if it's a biological matter, right? So that was my like way around that conceptually as I started to think about like what would be practical for this particular race. So anyway, the reason I bring that example up is like, when you understand that, like, you don't need to know the lore reason for why something works that way as a player, but if you're an enthusiast and you like the faction and you want to know more about the Ascozi, or you want to understand like more about, we talk about like hidden narratives or hidden themes or whatever. It's like some aspect of the Ascozi thematically is sort of carried through that lore of how their hijacking works, and you don't need to know anything about it in order to play the game and to play at a high level or to enjoy the game or whatever. But if you do, you might enjoy the setting that much more. And that's something that doesn't need to be reflected in the gameplay. I mean, technically it is reflected in the gameplay, but it doesn't need to be like front and center presented, right? So, yeah, I don't know. I think Brood War has a lot of cases where they have like wacky things, like the medics technically being like psychic, and the ghosts are also psychic. But what does psychic mean? Like, does that just mean they have energy? You know what I mean? Like, energy could be just considered. I mean, a fucking battlecruiser has energy, dude. Like, it doesn't have to be.
I always
psychic.
feel like the psionic stuff is like sort of silly. Like,
yeah,
even as a concept, like it's a bit weird. That like, I mean, sure, like conjuring something with your mind maybe is an interesting idea if explained and like done correctly, but it felt like it was very cheap in like StarCraft.
I don't think they really explained too much about how it worked mechanistically, yeah. But they just sort of used it as a hand wave. It's sort of like magic in most fantasy games is like, yeah, it's just magic, bro. And so like you
I
don't
think
know what
there's
it
actually
means.
something. I believe I watched some video on magic. Actually, it's like there's hard magic and soft magic, and hard magic is actually the good magic, and soft magic is the bad magic.
Well, soft magic, I
Because
imagine, is like something you can just change the rules on midway through, and it's just like, oh
yeah,
yeah,
that's
whatever.
basically inviting like any sort of like retcons. Like
Yeah,
you define the rules as you go,
yeah,
and hard magic is actually like you actually have set in stone rules on
yeah.
how things work, and you can actually expect it. Like it's built so much more fun and entertainment for the actual like watcher because they can anticipate things and
Oh yeah,
stuff. And with like soft magic, it's just like, oh, the author will do whatever actually he needs for the plot, and you really,
yeah.
it's just really silly.
I conceptualized magic in my fantasy setting as blood, actually. It was just going to be like something you were like everything that was organic was able to use because they like it used some aspect of like you could almost imagine you could have that in a science fiction or modern like setting as well because there's nothing actually magic about it. It's like you have this sort of like biological power and you might maybe you like reduce the oxygen in your blood which gives you like makes you more tired and stuff, right? Makes you more fatigued if you use the if you actually use a lot of it or whatever. And that's how like you have mana or energy or whatever the case may be. And like it just like if you think about it like that, where it's that sort of I mean, I agree that that would be like the hard magic in your example is like it sets up this framework for how interactions can occur. So yeah, I find it really silly when in the lore people decide to have basically soft magic, especially if it happens to be in sci-fi. But I mean, most things that are sci-fi actually have a lot of fantasy elements. They're just sort of like repackaged. And I don't just mean like, oh, in Warhammer 40K you have demons. I mean like it's more like it's a bit more like that. It's more like how they approach explaining how things occur. Like my version of like psionic in CMBW, I mean, this unit isn't implemented yet, but the Hypnagogue is a late tier Terran infantry unit that the way that he opens up portals is by using DMT. So like it's pretty wild. It's like a wacky concept. But it's like, yeah, that's a psychoactive. Like we don't know the limits of that. And like in my sci-fi setting, like these guys have been able to actually manifest real world impacting portals using the chemicals in their brain. It's like, okay, well I mean, you could imagine that sort of could happen, I guess, if you ascribe very powerful limitations or like very powerful capabilities to whatever DMT actually is. So yeah, like that's almost like a stoner idea, I guess, but it's that's like a thing. It's like, okay, well, maybe that's another way that they would express stuff. I think a lot of that is also probably inspired by reading the Dune books, where there's so many things that are done in that are about like if you don't have computers, what does innovation look like? And the innovation is like gene therapy and it's, meditation and like prescience and all of this other stuff that like is all related to, basically taking the human form and going to the limits of that instead of using technology to bridge the gap. Usually. I mean, technology still plays a part, but it's not computerized technology. There's no, motherboards or anything. No CPUs.
No AI.
No AI. No computers. So yeah, I don't know. That was probably a very. I mean, again, the question is very open ended. Maybe it gave Myrion some thoughts as to like more specific things he would like to talk about. But I guess to sum that one up, generally the mission design is like I just want the game. I want what you're doing in the game to be reflected in what the characters say, dialogue wise. Like that's how we have the reactionary dialogue. Like you kill somebody's base and they might say something about it, or you're under attack and you lose a base and your character might say something about it, right? It's like, it's all in tune. And at the same time, we don't need to remind you with a million dialogue events that like this character is an aggressive opponent or a passive opponent because they will remind you through their gameplay. Yeah. So
it's like both, they work in tandem. Like I said, it's like gameplay augments the story and story augments the gameplay because like the gameplay, something interesting, like gameplay tells its own story and like something in that gameplay happens and then there's some dialogue about it and like something organic where like, oh, you do something that is part of playing an RTS. Maybe you like expand, maybe you like kill something, maybe you like scout something, and you have dialogue about that, right? The augments Like it got augments the story augments the gameplay in that example, and then the gameplay also augments the story by like showing the characters, like cementing what you have learned in the story and stuff like that.
Story Ahmed's the gameplay. Oh shit.
Yeah.
Now what I should say though is yeah, like I look at the storytelling part and it's like, I mean, you can say that, yeah, there's an actual dialogue event, but also just the gameplay can be construed as a dialogue. It's like so you were talking about negotiations with an opponent. The same thing happens in the context of like units fighting each other or like players trying to jockey for position. So I think there's a lot that can work with that.
I guess not madness, but the corpses.
Yeah.
Talked about. Okay,
So
anyways, let's go.
Now that we're done with that question, I guess we, like you were saying earlier, Veeq, or like we were talking about earlier, we kind of already covered this next question. Myrion asks, discussing alternative resources / methods of gathering them, like the manipulation of corpses and the Kolypo Azos planned madness mechanic. So actually, Kolypo Azos have this, it's not a resource, it's how they actually tech up. And the Keltar have something like this too. They have combat-based tech progression. And you can kind of read a little bit about it on the Keltar tech page or whatever. But basically, the more time, like the more units that the Keltar lose individually, the more defensive options they will unlock. And the more units that they kill, the more offensive options they will unlock. And so that's based on, like, I haven't exactly decided how that will be done, but I have a basic idea. It's too complicated to get into it right now, but that's one of the ideas that I had. As basically, like, you can boil it down to you getting more defensive tech if you're losing a lot of units, and you getting more offensive tech if you're killing a lot of units. Now, this obviously does pose a problem if you're fighting a race that has low unit counts. Like you could imagine like a Zerg type race that just spams a lot of weak units. The Keltar have they kind of have low unit counts themselves because they're more about durable individual units. So, but that's like, you could kind of think about it like, how do you progress? If you progress
Maybe
through
the
madness
way-
or something, then that's what.
Maybe the way to do it would be to do it by damage dealt and damage taken then.
I mean, the only thing that I could see as being stupid about that is if it's damage taken, then you could be like tickling a fucking command center equivalent with like a worker and like progressing their tech. And so you as your opponent would be punished for damaging you, right? So I think if you actually lose a unit, then it's a little bit different, right? Because if you lose a unit, then your opponent has meaningfully gained an advantage over you by killing one of your units, even if it's also given you some sort of advantage elsewhere. It forces Keltar to fight in order to progress their tech, which is very important for their thematic. So that's the main reason why I wanted to go that approach.
Yeah.
The Kolypo Azos madness thing, it's probably going to be like a ramping debuff, and the more time spent with that debuff stacked up is going to like somehow equate to growth in some other area. But I haven't decided. That's one of the reasons why the Kolypo Azos are going to be the last, like amongst the last regencies to be added to the game, is because that's like a very ambitious idea, and I don't yet know how I'm going to tackle it. But that was one of the ideas I had, is like, they're just an ambitious regency. Like the Kolypo Azos, I had this idea that you would see like manifestations of them being extra dimensional, because they would like appear to vanish from the plane that you're seeing, and they would reappear like, across your screen or something like that. And that's just like wacky shit. Like, how the fuck do they even do that?
I've actually seen I watched some explanation of like dimensions and how they work. And actually there was like a very interesting definition of what could you see as, like, basically each dimension is an infinite repetition of the previous dimension.
Yeah.
And that actually makes it like way more epic if you see it that way. Like, it's
actually a very simple.
With.
It's hard to like, you can't imagine infinity, but if you can kind of comprehend what that statement is, it's a very simplified explanation of extra dimensions, right?
Yeah, it's like, oh, you have a parallel 3D stuff nearby, basically, and then you have the more further away ones, right? Like, it's like 2D and 3D. Like, oh, you have this, like, 3D is just 2D layered on top of each other, right? Like, if you would, like, you could visualize it by the fucking Antikythera layer system.
Yeah.
It's like, that's 3D. Like, they just repeat, and one is next to another, and
It's
pretty
threes
cool.
all the way down.
Yeah.
So yeah. Anyway, there's not much to comment on too much about Kolypo Azos because it's kind of early in the conception. But Keltar are a release regency, so I've obviously planned a lot more for them, and so hopefully that explains how I was planning on doing that. But it wasn't related to actually harvesting nuts and bolts, magmite, and hypervials. It was how they tech up. So anyway, that probably answers his question.
Can you actually explain a bit the extra-dimensionality of Sycora? Because you have this like very unusual concept of them being trapped in the third dimension, and I can't really wrap my mind around that. Like, it feels to me like it doesn't make any sense. But maybe you thought about it a lot, so I would be interested in hearing about that.
So there's a talk, I think it might have been on the Joe Rogan podcast, but Eric Weinstein has described before that if you want to travel to another dimension, then you have to give up a superpower in order to get there. And that, he was specifically speaking in the context of like mathematics and how it intersects with physics. So it doesn't really align neatly with actual organisms in my opinion, but I also am not a fucking physicist, so I don't pretend to have authority. I will say I can't comprehend exactly how it would work with that. But the idea behind the Sycora is that, like, I kind of think about it like if you had to become a 2-dimensional creature, you would lose the ability to move in the 3rd dimension. And that would obviously change how you look and how you feel and what you can do, because you can no longer be tall or whatever you pick your 3rd dimension is. Like, you can no longer do certain things.
Depending
you
on
give
which
up.
dimension you actually remove, right?
Yeah. So if you become a 2D creature and you're removing a dimension of space as opposed to a dimension of time, like the Catethrons are using a dimension of time that we don't understand. That's why they work the way that they do. But the Sycorans use a dimension of space that we do not have access to. So that's how, like, they are basically being compressed into a 3-dimensional space, which obviously, I mean, I would imagine that if it were possible at all, it would probably be incredibly uncomfortable, or at the very least,
I feel like
disconcerting.
it wouldn't be possible, but like the way I could imagine it, like, because you could, there's sort of this theory that you have like infinite universes, right? And let's say there's like a parallel universe that's like not carbon-based life or whatever, but you could also probably have an alternate like parallel universe that is actually 4D, right?
Yeah.
So if they were like forcibly by some like power brought to this universe, and they would have to be 3D. I assume that process itself would be very destructive, right?
I mean, they leave behind a part of themselves whenever they travel to the 3rd dimension, or when they become 3-dimensional entities, you could say. However, anyway, like the main thing you can look at is like the Sycora at some point discovered that there exists 3-dimensional space absent their space, because the setting of Zabalba isn't just, it's not like there's a 4th dimension that the Sycora exist in and they can choose to interact with the 3rd dimension, because we can choose to interact with a piece of paper that exists within our universe, right? Or like an ant or something. Like those are commonly seen as 2-dimensional creatures.
Yeah, it's like a parallel universe, more like.
Yeah.
Like it feels to me, at least.
Well, in the case of like the Zabalba setting, it's like they're both traversing space to get into this universe and also giving up a part of themselves. It's like 2 things, right? It's 2 different actions, basically. So it's not just that there's like an alternate universe that's like our version of that would be if we could travel to a piece of paper that's in another universe. That's sort of what the Sycora are doing. You can kind of think about it like that. So they're definitely doing it, differently than you would think. Like, it's really wacky physics would be involved in this. And
I think it also would be really interesting, even probably
ahead.
more ambitious than Sycora, to have a race that is actually fourth dimension, but shares the universe with us or whatever, where they
Well,
would be able to freely move to like through the fourth dimension. They would like randomly just be able to vanish and like
yeah, that's the Kolypo Azos, right?
yeah,
Extra
that
dimensional.
is what I thought it was, but I wasn't actually sure.
Yeah, I don't know if they're only 4. They might be more than that, but they are definitely.
I feel like 4 is ambitious already, but sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the idea you have to remember that the context of the Kolypo Azos, like if they lose a fight, right? When they lose like a battle, they're more like, I can't believe I lost this video game, than they are like, I can't believe we've lost this battle. We're dead now. We're actually gonna no, like the stakes are completely different. They're basically trolls. So yeah, like they have their own like agendas and stuff. But you could almost think of them as like vacationing in whatever the setting is. You know what I mean? Like that's more what they're doing. So
I wonder, because you said about Cathethrons having an additional time dimension, so that means they're 3D spatially, but 2D time-wise,
temporally,
right?
yeah.
Temporally. So does that mean they can like? Do they have like some? Because time is weird because it's like a one dimension, but also unidirectional for us, where we can't travel back.
Yeah.
So they have 2 dimensions. Is it also like unidirectional, or how does it work?
Well, it's just that we don't
like time travel.
We don't have the language to describe meeting somebody at 3 p.m. and 12:30. But we can say here's 2 spatial coordinates. We can't give you 2 temporal coordinates. The Cathethrons have the 2 temporal coordinates. I admit I have to research more about this to explain more about how it works, but it's definitely one of those things where it's like it's a complete, not a complete inversion, but it's very much orthogonal to our current understanding of how things work to try to imagine 2 separate time coordinates. But basically, that's how they go
ahead. Time could be imagined like 1D dimension spatially, but you're just falling.
Yeah.
That's basically how you could imagine time being, right? Like you're just falling in 1D.
Yeah, but you don't really know what it is to walk in time. You know what I mean? Like you can fall.
It's just like you're stuck in one direction.
Yeah, but like can you if you can fall to the right as opposed to fall to the left or whatever, like I mean we can't even imagine going backwards
sort
in time,
of like decisionally, like when decisions happen you could sort of imagine that branching, but it's a different thing, yeah.
That's like
that's even more ambitious than the 4th dimension spatially. So
yeah.
See how that goes.
Yeah, I don't know. Like I don't know that my experiments in CM retail will be capable of being a definitive manifesto on how physics might work. Like that's not necessarily the main idea, but I also admit I don't want to play around with big ideas without an actual understanding of what they mean. So, like that's part of what makes it significant, right? It's like not just rule of cool nonsense. I mean, there's rule of cool. I mean, there's cool things, but we're trying to earn them, right? So.
Yeah, because otherwise it could end up a confusing mess, right? Even if you explain it very much, just like
well, it could be like you can explain it all you want if it doesn't make sense to us. Like my current. You can call it cop-out or excuse or whatever is we just don't understand all of the things that are out there. So just like me explaining that DMT unlocks teleports for, like infantry and CMBW, that doesn't make sense for our current understanding of DMT and of like space and dimensions and shit.
Well, you might need to...
So
one way to do it is to concretize assumptions that we have, right? Like we... don't really know if there is a soul or whatever, but you can make an assumption that there is in a game, and you just say that there's a soul and it has those properties, and you can define those, right? This is not exactly... It doesn't exactly have to be like real life. It just has to like resemble it. And we also wouldn't want the spatial stuff to like behave inconsistently with the 3rd dimension or whatever, or like... It's just like stuff to think about, right? Like it's... a lot of things.
And a lot of things are also things we think about. Sorry, let me try that again. We think about a lot of things when we play games. So tell me about the game you played recently.
I think you should actually talk about your game first. You'll do one, I will do one, and then you do one. Is
Okay.
that way I can actually reflect on some stuff.
Okay, gotcha. I thought you just wanted to hear about burning every plant in Gotham, but
Yeah, that is also it. You got
yeah.
me.
So the first game I'll talk about is Gotham Knights, and as you might guess, just based on the tone of my fucking voice, it's such a disgustingly stupid game. You're familiar a little bit with Batman Arkham Knight because you watched my playthrough of that, and I think you probably also watched the other one. I forget what came before. It's
I
not
didn't
Arkham
watch
City.
a lot of it, but
Yeah, I don't even remember which one had burning every plant in Gotham. I think it was Knight. Yeah, it was.
Arkham Knight, I think.
Yeah. So anyway, like some great dialogue, right? But aside from that, like you remember how like the combat was kind of stupid, it's like this beat 'em up, you just push one button to dodge all damage and etc.
Yeah,
And
it was heavily worse than Assassin's Creed, and
that's an accomplishment, right? But now Gotham Knights combat is worse because there's no block button, but you have to evade. Like basically attacks almost home onto you, even if they're melee. So you have to use your evade key. Yeah, you have to use your evade key in order to actually evade, which interrupts your combat, and then you go back to punching or whatever. So like they actually made it worse than the previous games, which is also an accomplishment. Anyway, that's not the main reason why I uninstalled the game after like 2 hours of playing or 3 hours of playing. The multiplayer didn't really work very well. It was very inconsistent. But my brother was able to escape and refund, and I idled in the menu too long or something, so I was not able to escape with my money intact. However,
is it a multiplayer game?
Yes. So it's also like more open world-ish, I guess, but you're still in Gotham City, so it's not like the biggest map. However, the gameplay, like they basically make, in order to progress in the main story, Arkham Knight had like a series of things you could all investigate, and like, oh, you can kind of do some stuff that's very obviously boring, like defusing bombs that cause like shit to spawn at you, and those aren't really interesting. But then there's all this other stuff, like you can pursue like Penguin and like see what you can get out of him, and that like makes you play with Nightwing and stuff, and it's like, oh, that's like one thing that's like, one angle you can go down. There's all these like side missions that like take you down to certain things that you can choose to interact with, and there's like a bunch of different main things you can progress through at once. And at least in the opening couple hours of Gotham Knights, you only have one thing you can really progress at once meaningfully, and the way you gather progress for the story missions is by fighting like repetitive environments or repetitive events of like them. It's just like the most boring things imaginable, but you also have to like tag each unit individually to see if they know anything that you can interrogate. And if you accidentally knock them out before the end of the fight, then you have to go back and do it all over again. And you don't always get somebody who can be interrogated in every fight. So it just turns into this stupid grind fest of unimaginable proportions.
A lot of grind. Yeah, that's always what open worlds become. Like I feel like I haven't seen one that doesn't. It's just like open worlds never earned their open worldness. It's not like the world is actually alive. It's just like they added space in between linear missions. Like epic.
Yeah. Well, there was one linear mission that I got access to by beating up a bunch of stupid grind idiots. And it was like it was like you were supposed to visit Harley Quinn in a jail, and the jail was like under attack from the inmate riots or something. And you fought some like fat woman because patriarchy or whatever. And then at the end, Harley Quinn like escapes off screen, and your character goes, "Huh, I can't believe she escaped." And it's like, wait, what? She escaped? I didn't even know that because it happened off camera. So that was good. And yeah, after that, like there's some more dialogue where it's like I think it was Alfred was like, do you have any leads on what has to happen next? And he was like, no, I just know that this faction might be involved. And he's like, well, you better get interrogating or something. And I'm just like, fuck. What did you say?
Is every player just Batman?
No, Batman dies. He can't burn any plant in Gotham anymore.
Oh no.
Yeah, what the fuck, dude? Worst game. So instead you play as Batgirl or Robin or Nightwing or Red Hood, who is revived. I forget Arkham Knight. I think it was actually Arkham Knight. That was his name. Like the edgelord character that was actually Jason Todd or something. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Sort
Edgelord
of, I guess.
Robin gets abducted by Joker and turns into Edgelord Arkham Knight, and that's his explanation for being Arkham Knight in Arkham Knight. And then he dies because Joker kills him in Arkham Knight, but he gets revived off screen in a Lazarus pit, and that's what turns him into Red Hood. No, unfortunately, it's not as cool. It's not time travel. Anyway, what were you saying?
Not.
What were you going to say next? Anyway, the game is shit. That's my review.
Terrible. I'm just wondering, how many players can you?
I think it's up to 4 because there's 4 characters.
Oh, that's just a co-op game. Okay.
Yeah. Well, you can play it single player too, but it's just like a series of grinding things. You can level up your gear, but you have to collect like things in order to level your gear up with like currency or whatever by opening up chests in the game that are just like around the map for some reason.
I can't believe all the new games just have to make up artificial reasons for you to play, and people actually buy into those. Like,
yeah.
So bad.
I just don't like. I don't want to play a game for like 60 hours unless there's actually 60 hours of game, but there isn't. So uninstalled.
No, it's just spaces out the positive stuff, which is not even that positive. But it feels more positive because there's a lot of grind around it. That's basically how they do it.
Yeah, I don't know. I just easily recognize that I don't care about any of this stuff because I could be playing something more rewarding and enjoyable, like Cosmonarchy Brood War, dude.
Yeah. There's one thing I forgot to ask you about when we were talking about pacing, so I'll throw it now.
Okay.
We haven't really touched advanced workers at all. They used to give you more income, and now they don't. What do you think we would do about it?
Did they used to give you more income?
Yeah. Tiny bit amount more.
Well, most people are starting to experiment with maps that only have bases which are accessible by advanced workers. So that would be one obvious way that you could use them. However, and I mean like you can't even like transport or lift off or land because like the minimum distance is too much. So you have to use advanced workers to scale the cliffs or whatever. Like the resource nodes are on cliffs. Obviously AI are totally cucked by that, but maybe we can fix that in the future. However, the main idea that I would have behind the advanced workers is since you're going to have less of them in general, they would probably be best served for like niche uses. Like obviously you can use them as dedicated builders because they build structures faster. And you could also use them for those harvesting on the cliff. So I think it's a combination of people not really getting to tier 3 very often to use them. And also, AI Zerg ones are still busted, so we can't use them for them. And then also the general idea of like the maps allowing you to harvest resources from only advanced workers is kind of new-ish. Like people don't do it too often. So
yeah. Well, I'm just afraid it will break AI, so I don't. I mean, I know it will break AI, so I just don't bother.
What do you mean? Oh, you don't like you don't bother with the bases.
With the bases.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if it breaks AI. They just don't expand there, or do they actually try to? I would just say
it can create multiple towns that are fake towns, and they will create a town there, and they will fail to expand, so they will lose time expanding to a position that is invalid for them, or that they cannot use. Or
if we can somehow detect that the base is inaccessible, maybe we can even do some configuration, like one of those not yet implemented flags on the town center to indicate it, or the town center mark. I don't know. Something like that might be useful, or I guess it could be on the resources themselves. And if we can do something like that to key to the AI that you can just ignore this base, then that might be enough. Because at least then they won't do that. But humans will only be able the ones to use it until we can find a way to make them useful or whatever. So I don't know, it's just a thought.
Yeah. Could work. Anyways, let's talk about Rerun.
Let's talk about Rerun.
That's the game that we mentioned on the last episode, and I've actually played it on the live stream. It will be linked in the description. And let's talk about it. I'll try to find the name of the creator. So I completely have forgot, and I don't want to butcher it.
Well, his
So, good
username
games
in the
exist.
email was Pr0nogo, but I think he's Pin
Pr0nogo.
A in the server. So
Yeah, I think I had my title as Pr0nogo, but anyways, this is a 2D game, 2D turn-based game with a lot of pixel art. I've been getting some eye strain when I played it, but it's not as important as what the game actually was. It was like an interesting roguelike thing where I only played the demo, so I haven't got the full experience. But it's like you pick two characters and they have different abilities. But then when you go into the levels, so the first level, I think, yeah, the first level is actually no choice. It's always the same as like introductory one, but then the second one you pick out of few options, and each option is a different level, and it gives you different rewards, and those rewards alter the way that characters play, and introduces actually some interesting mechanics where maybe you will actually synergize with, because you have two characters, you might pick something that allows you to synergize with them better. So, for example, I had this guy that was able to tank stuff. So he basically becomes an invincible or untargetable unit for one frame, one turn. So then I got an upgrade that allowed me to like shoot past the guy, and it actually allowed me to combine the characters in an interesting way. For example, so I felt like the game has potential, but I was like suggesting to the author that it would be neat if the game had more scale, had bigger levels. I didn't actually mention that maybe having more characters at the same time would be neat, but I think it would be. Just having bigger levels, bigger puzzles, bigger. I mean, those are not puzzles, but bigger like things to solve, and like just having more interesting stuff and less actually limiting factors, because he had like a mechanic where he only your moves were limited, so they had like usages. So you had like you started with like 10 attacks and like 3 specials or something.
how do you get them back? Do you get them back or what?
You do, but you replenish them as a choice. So you can either replenish free, I think, and then or you can get the reward for the level. So that was pretty lame, I would say.
Yeah, well, it depends on what the rewards are. I guess are the rewards like actually upgrading stuff? Because that's a pretty big loss.
Yeah, it's the reason you play the game. So
yeah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess that would be kind of like it. Well, it's funny because I had the idea that maybe in Onitar, which is like talking about Onitar's progression, is how we got connected with Pr0nogo. So that's why it makes me think about it. But I had the idea that maybe you'd be able to decide either to use the pretense system or do something else with the reward. Of course, it would still be a reward. It's not like you lost something that you had to replenish. So it's a bit of a different example. But I remember thinking, I don't know if it makes sense to make the choice, like make a choice out of what is the essence of the game. And that's sort of what you made me think of when you said that. So it's just kind of neat that like funny that we both had sort of like as designers had both thought something similar, except he ended up going forward with it. I guess one of the things that strikes me about the game is that from what limited I've seen, it does seem like a very like it's within his wheelhouse to make, and it's. I mean, you can tell that because he made it, and obviously, I exist in this crazy space where I imagine like insane scale and all this other stuff. So, not yet within my power to do. So it was neat to see him be able to do that, and he also seemed very receptive to some of the feedback that you had given him. So. It was neat.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think like he actually had technical limitations gate him, because like the amount of entities and the size of levels is actually not that big. Like he could easily double it and you wouldn't see a problem. Like even Acer that he had for paths is like it's like a non-challenge for the size of maps that he had. Like 128 by 128, which we have in Antikythera by default now, wouldn't even be his like level of size. I don't think. But like just doubling or tripling some of the earlier levels would make it awesome. I mean, I played the demo and he said that he has bigger levels later. I just haven't reached them, so maybe that's fine. But I felt like the early levels were like, oh, actually, that sort of. I don't want to be insulting, but it sort of reminds me of UDAP, which is very low scale and it like forces you to solve a puzzle with very limited resources and being at a disadvantage. So that's sort of what it reminds me of. And what I would rather see is like a big scale thing, which allows the. I really enjoyed the complexity of the game being placed in sort of the correct places where it doesn't have like 10 billion attributes and stats. It actually was very simple and it had very simple rules for the cards, but ones that were making like interesting gameplays were like, oh, you have like a push unit to back one tile, and if it hits a wall, take 1 damage as a thing. And actually really interesting because now you can like imagine how you could combine it with some wall ability maybe or something like. It's positional. It's like it serves multiple purposes. It's like nuanced, right? But it's really simple and like it's really simple to understand what it does. But actually, like once you have scale, it allows simplicity combined with like forethought to create like depth and interest in the game, I think. So once you have that, I think the game could get really like successful and just fun to play. I mean, I know that he has fun playing it. I had some fun playing it too. It's just I think my biggest pain point was the ice train, but also like it just felt like I could easily play a better game if some like probably easy improvements were made. So if he does actually like he doesn't have to necessarily agree with everything I say, but if he does make some changes to make it even better, that would be really great.
Yeah. It was neat to see. At some point, he said he was already planning on making changes. I guess most of, or some of them will have been based on your feedback. I know Mess gave him some visual feedback, so we'll see what happens there. But what was also cool about the Good Games Exist channel was that people started to offer doing, playtests or recorded playthroughs similar to what Veeq did with the stream, just based on the fact that like it was posted and there were some, it's like if that can be a more commonplace thing that happens in the No Frauds Club as a community, that would be really great because now you can sort of like say, hey, I want honest feedback about my game. Here's the game, or here's a demo for the game or whatever. Like, tell me what you think. Or, that sort of thing could be quite neat.
Just imagine that one day Jonathan Blow posts his game there, his newest game.
Yeah.
That would be epic.
Yeah. Good Games Exist, guys. Here's one by me.
Here's
well, I'm still waiting for Jonathan Blow to
game.
stream his stream that you had a dream about where you were like, yeah, Jonathan Blow was angrily reacting to Xibalba Regencies or something like that.
Yeah, it was something like that. He was like talking about like, oh, this reminds me of this, and like, oh, this is like this trope or something. I don't know. It was something.
I just remember you saying it was like episode 41 or something of a series. He had been doing this for like months, presumably.
Yeah,
I liked it. I
don't know if the whole series was about Xibalba.
I see. Yeah, it could have been like Trope Taka or something. Okay.
Yeah, I guess.
Interesting. See, we can make this a reality. We just need to send him our game when it's ready for a pitch, and he will say, "Wow, this is great," and then money.
Well, when he sees the amount of cycles that pathfinding takes, that's probably unlikely. But
imagine if he was like, I was gonna give you money for this game, but it was a little bit too slow on the pathfinding there. So see ya. That would be perfect.
But that's funny. But I don't know. We just have to polish it up, and it will be epic.
Well, I already have a Polish on my team. Oh, sorry, Polish on my team. So it'll be good. Easy.
Blizzard Polish.
Blizzard Polish. So, I guess that takes me to my game. My game, the other game that I played, which is called Wizard of Legend. And you guys can check it out. I think it was on for like a $4 sale recently. It might still be like that. But it's a 2D, also pixel art game.
Yeah, one sec. I would just want to say that give Rerun a try if you
Yeah.
were interested by what I said. It's decent.
Oh yeah, I
It's
guess I'll say
currently a free demo.
I didn't even finish my point either. Is that I will also give it a try on a stream at some point when it's updated, so that I can provide my feedback to the things that have actually been changed, as opposed to like
Yeah, if it gets updated, I will stream that too.
yeah, cool. Well, and you can join the Discord server to keep up to date with games like Rerun, since that's apparently where people will start posting when there's updates, which is pretty neat. So there is that as well. But yeah, I played a game called Wizard of Legend. It's also a pixel art game. It's also 2D. It's about using stuff in real time. You can kind of think about it similar to Binding of Isaac. It's not quite bullet helly. It has some bullet hell aspects to it. I mean, Binding of Isaac isn't even necessarily bullet helly, but yeah. Anyway, like there's some interesting ideas. There's a lot of slow progression because you have to unlock stuff that you will randomly find. Like there's some roguelite elements to that. The dialogue is very cringe, so there's a warning for you. It's like you walk into a boss and they're a lightning boss. And they're like, we're about to give you an electrifying performance or some shit. Like they just say all these puns that are about like whatever element they are. Like the fire woman says, I'm going to turn up the heat. And it's like, I'm dying. Please stop talking. And so
I am dying.
Yeah.
That was actually sad on the third episode of Antikythera live streams if you want to check that out. I don't know if it's actually
dying. It might as well have been 3, yeah. When Veeq implemented death animations and was so tired because he was sleep Q7 that he said, check it out.
Like, look, I'm dying.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect reenactment. So yeah, anyway, that was a real thing. So yeah, aside from the occasional case like that and the general feeling that it's actually really hard to read in multiplayer. It's a little bit easier in single player, but in multiplayer, like I remember you start off as red and blue and they don't do anything. You can have up to 2 players and it's through Steam Remote Play because it's co-op. It's like couch co-op only or whatever. And it's really confusing because you might end up like there was one point where we unlocked a suit that was teal and I picked it and my brother stayed on blue instead of red for the suit that did nothing. So it was blue and teal, and I just regularly thought I was him, and he regularly thought he was me. So, and the camera also doesn't split for the 2 of you either, right? Because it's like couch co-op, so you can't be on different parts of the map or whatever. Which I guess I understand why they would want that, because they want you to co-op and play together instead of just splitting up and doing your own thing. But it makes it really difficult to see some stuff sometimes, and it's not really an elegant solution to that, I don't think so. Besides making the game readable.
I looked it up right now. I like the art style personally. Like I like out of pixel games. I think this is like a pretty good style.
I don't think they do that silly subpixel thing. Yeah, so it probably helps with that.
It's just like also the colors seem to be decent, and they have like a reasonable tile map and whatnot. So yeah, that's good to see.
It's not offensively pixel art. I'll put it to you that way. So I'm not somebody who usually.
It's like I feel like pixel art, if done like tastefully, has actually a really nice aesthetic. But if done not tastefully, where it's like this subpixel thing, and it's just done for the heck of it, it's actually really eye strainy and just gets into your way. And it's like obviously like it's like even pretentious, I would say.
Well, obviously the most tasteful pixel art is Undertale, so pack it up, boys. No. We've already reached peak male form.
No.
People have been rediscovering my hidden Let's Play of that game, and Jesus, it really is a disaster. So
the game, of course, the stream was actually really funny.
Yeah, well, for the 12 people, by the way, who can ever watch it, I hope you guys enjoy. It is quite the hoot. I think in general, Wizard of Legend is like, I mean, the name is really generic. Something I forgot to mention actually is that I think it's kind of neat that Rerun is called Rerun because I don't know, there's something about the simplicity of that name plus the fact that like it is what you do in some ways is really neat. Whereas Wizard of Legend is like, what the fuck? Like, That is probably the most.
I mean, Rerun, like, I like the essence of the game being captured in the name.
Yeah.
But it sort of like would remind me of, I don't know, that might be me, but it sort of would remind me of like some futuristic game where maybe you're like time traveling or something, and it also would be a roguelike probably. But yeah, it's definitely.
Yeah, it doesn't
definitely
really
a good-
encapsulate the fantasy element or whatever. Like that's true. Like
Yeah.
if it were if the progression was the same, but it was like an action platformer instead, like that would probably be the most actualized, right?
There's something I actually watched recently. So there's this very old game called Dwarf Dungeon, I think. Is that it? Let me check.
I'm trying to remember. There's Dwarf Fortress. Is that what you're talking about?
Dwarf Fortress, yeah.
It got a Steam release like last year, I think.
Yeah, that game has 20 years or something, so it's really old. And it has something interesting about it where every time you play and you fail a run, it permanently affects the game.
Yeah.
I think that is really neat. If that was actually in Rerun, that would be so epic. Like, imagine you just like stumble onto your own corpse. I may misremember, but I think Onitar was planning to do something like that. No.
Yeah. I mean, I wasn't sure exactly how I was going to implement it, but it was something like. I mean, you can kind of think about it as. Yeah, so what you're probably thinking of is how the AI interact with you. Like they will have memories of the past fights that you've done. I'm not sure if that'll be self-contained within a run because you'll face the same enemy multiple times usually, or if that would actually transcend that and be like, oh,
if they didn't break the fourth wall magically knowing that it's you, that would be really interesting. How they would like mention that, oh, I fought this stupid over-aggressive idiot, or there was this conservative guy that now made me like be a bit more calculated or something. It was really a threat. Thankfully, I have defeated him or something like.
Oh, I see. Like they would reference the fact that they've beaten the player, but they would be that would be worked into their composite. Yeah, I mean, I was planning on having the AI kind of like they have their own game plan, and then there's like certain levers that we pull to adapt them to some degree, and so I think that would be
that's
in the
one
case.
thing. But just I was also talking about how the dialogue
would
flow, right?
You would, I mean, you would want to work that into the dialogue for sure.
Yeah,
or it would make sense for them to, like, even if it's something as simple as like, you know, you do an opener that they like they lost to at one point.
You know how you said that obsidians are rarely destroyed because it's a disaster when that happens?
Yeah.
Imagine if destroying an obsidian was permanent on your save. And if you actually destroyed all of them, something special would maybe happen or something.
Well, you'd have to you'd probably need to be able to reset the particular battleground you were fighting over, like the particular planet or whatever.
But imagine if you just were able to like time travel and you had to like you destroyed all obsidian, so now you have to like perform this expensive time travel ritual to like you're cooperating with some factions, you're fighting some other factions, and now you have to restore.
Well, I don't know about the time travel idea, but you remember that one of the ideas I had was the more obsidians you had reconfigured to your personal faction's like identity, the more like that would also dictate the access that you had to other territories. So you would have to you'd have to control, like, you know, say the first couple obsidians in an area in order to access like the third dimension of the overworld map that would take you inside whatever planetary body you were on. And so stuff like that would be pretty big, I think, pretty interesting, because the overworld map itself would actually like shift and reveal another layer you could go down. So I think that that alone is already a pretty big deal. But if you imagine that destroying the obsidians condenses the gameplay space, because unlocking them and configuring them increases the gameplay space, that could also play into what you're talking about. I don't know how it would turn into exactly, but like losing control of obsidians reduces the number of territories you can attack. So that would be like one thing that you have to manage. So them actually being destroyed. I mean, it would be lunacy. Like,
Imagine
you're basically
if
doing
you
that on
actually
hard
had a
modes.
choice. You either reclaim or destroy, and if you want to destroy, it's actually a like free-for-all survival 1-2 hour mission or something, where you have to like hold out against all the other factions that want to prevent it because it's so valuable. And then there's just like this story path that you can take as like, I want to corrupt all the essence. I want to like reject it. I want to like destroy every obsidian or whatever.
Yeah. That will, I mean, the other factions would definitely not be kosher with you destroying the fucking finite resources. So, yeah. Just like in, Zabalba, planetary destruction is possible, but it also destroys the resources, and there's a finite number of those. So, kind of need them. So, yeah, we would have to see.
I imagine it would be a very interesting like story space to happen. It would be really good to have procedural dialogues and stuff. I don't know how we could accomplish that, but it would be really.
I'm sure some cuckney out there will decide it is a good idea to have procedural AI generate fucking dialogue and voice acting, but all of the stuff I've seen so far is
control
just,
for us.
Yeah, all of the stuff I've seen so far is really bad for that. Well, anyway, I guess that brings us to the conclusion of this 2.5 hour long Crow's Nest. So, how are you feeling? Any words you want to end with, or any topics you feel like we didn't get enough of, or anything like that?
Well, I want to say that I appreciate all the coffees. That's for sure, and I appreciate anyone who stayed to this moment, actually listened to stuff. So yes, you Myrion, and yes, you someone. So.
Yeah, dude. Obviously, Keyan. Every time we say Keyan's name, he's like, "Oh, I got mentioned." He told me that. So.
That's like Polish people when they hear Polish on international television, they just like freak out.
That's funny. Oh, I guess that's because I don't have that. I can't really have that perspective because obviously I speak English. But it would almost be like if somebody referenced StarCraft on like news, I would be like, "What? Huh?"
CS talk show maybe.
Yeah, there you go. I mean, that's usually me doing that. So.
Yeah. That was interesting to see you say that on the Fungal.
Yeah. So check me out, dude. We got Thorin coming on next. Big guest.
Oh, that's epic.
Get to get his take on all the.
She had some really cool stuff posted recently about the One Way book, I think.
Yes. Yeah, on his side channel, he's got some pretty good stuff there. So
definitely recommend that.
Yeah, I'll try to remember to throw that in the description too. So there it is. That's it. We're out.
Yeah.
That's Crow's Nest Q7. See ya.
Q7.